we can record.
It's recorded.
Got it. I put it on auto so we wouldn't forget. Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. We've got people just navigating parking garages and that sort of thing, so Colin should be here momentarily. My name's Lisa. I'm going to be helping with the meeting today. This is an interesting meeting in that it's not actually a meeting that's run by staff, although the staff have been asked to make some presentations. It's really about this group and what this group wants to do. I also brought in a note taker today just because that way we could all pay attention. Rather, I know sometimes Mike and I share note-taking duties, and it's nice when somebody else can take notes. So that part is really awesome. Thank you so much for that. And we've got the amazing Francisco who's going to help us just manage the online meeting. And those of you who haven't met Francisco, I highly recommend it. So the next time you're around, be sure to take a chance to do that. Why don't we go ahead and just kind of hop in and do some quick introductions about who's actually in the room with us. We'll check in with the folks on the phone. And then I'm guessing Colin will be jumping in just in moments, literally, while we're doing the introductions. So Lou, do you want to start?
Sure. Lou Moeller, Project Manager, California Water.
I'm Mike Antos. I'm a Senior Watershed Manager at SAPA. In my past life, I was a Council for Watershed Health, an NGO down in Los Angeles that had one of the 7 pilots the DWR funded a while back. And I helped convene the 2013 event in Calistoga that I think we're talking about today as well.
Yeah, the visioning, sort of DAC IRW envisioning workshop.
Great. Good morning. Anna C. Augustinus with Department of Water Resources. I also serve as the Tribal Policy Advisor.
Thank you for being here, too. I know getting you in a meeting is a big deal.
I also invited Sherry Norris.
Yes,
she should be on the phone or on her way in.
Yeah, I'm expecting her. She did register online, so she'll probably be here.
Hi, Jose Alarcon, Department of Water Resources.
Emily Alejandrino, Department of Water Resources.
Paul Macera, Department of Water Resources. I'm the Program Manager for the California Water Plan.
He's the one that has most of the stress. Just kind of do color commentary on the people in the room.
But I get to feel it well sometimes.
Yeah, or not.
Yeah.
All right, Lisa, Francisco.
Francisco Guzman, Water Plan Staff.
Kristen Pringle, Stantec.
Great, thank you. And then Francisco, do you want to introduce the folks that can hop in? So.
Yeah, so we have online, we have Horatio Mesqua.
And then for any of you online, we'd love to hear you talk. So feel free to call in, or if you have a headset with your mic, we'll open your mics. We want to be able to engage with you. So if that's an option for you, please do that.
Yes, just send us a chat and I'll open your mic.
Yeah, we'll open the mic because we want to hear from you.
So we have Karen Nelson, Lauren Miller, Len Rodriguez, Sua Lee, and Tanya Serta.
Super, thank you so much. And again, if any of you want to hop in, you can just either raise your hand or send a chat and we'll open your mic. The easiest thing to do is have a headset or use your phone. So let's go ahead. There was a draft agenda that was circulated, and folks are welcome to add to that. Why don't we go ahead and go over the agenda real quick. So first of all is the meeting purpose. Francisco. So I can go 2 ways. I can actually see it on the screen, or I can try to read it on the paper. That vision thing. Okay. So the purpose is to understand and support the support and service DWR intends the water plan update to provide communities experiencing environmental injustices in light of the significantly different process from Water Plan 2013. We want to uncover and set the agenda for this caucus to partner and advocate in support of an effective water plan. And we want you to know there'll be a facilitated discussion with notes so that we can kind of follow up and get back to people. And we've already completed the welcome and introduction. One of the first things we'll do is hop in, and as soon as Colin gets here, if he has any opening remarks, I'll invite that. But we'll go ahead and get started with Paul kind of walking over what's been going on since the plenary, hear from Anacita and Emily about what's going on with the tribal activities. And we're always really cautious with that because there's some linkages, but they're not the same thing. So part of it is just creating that collaboration, and a lot of complexities around that, I think. Then Paul's actually prepared a walkthrough of the text and the chapter information, and there's some really interesting things going on. Our goal for today is we really just want to have a roll up our sleeves kind of an informal conversation. We're going to use everything that you do today to help inform what's going to happen next week at the funding workshop. So the input today is hugely important and hugely helpful. And we don't actually need to encourage this group to do it, but we are looking forward to you kind of poking holes and asking really hard questions. I think that's going to be the most helpful thing you can do for the team to help them get ready for kind of this larger conversation on funding. The next thing then, we've also got some tone things that Paul's got a new chapter 1 that's kind of laid up the tone a little differently. And when we talk a little bit about what's happened since, we'll kind of share a little bit about the impact that the caucus has had already. Then we have some potential white papers that Mike Yantos has already mentioned. We can talk about next steps, and then we can kind of see how y'all felt about the meeting at the end. So are there others that need anything different, or we're looking for a different process for the agenda? Online, same thing. If any of you feel free to hop in. There's Colin. So Colin, we've already reviewed the agenda. We've done some introductions. Would you like, I know you're just catching your breath, and I thought there was a lot trying to get in the building also.
There was.
Yeah. Do you want to make any opening remarks or talk about your hopes for the session today?
Yeah, well, if you just reviewed the agenda, then you saw some of the aims of why we're here. Depending on how many people are with us, those aims may or may not be well served. Just as a little background, I served along with many around the state on the Environmental Justice Disadvantaged Community Caucus for the 2013 update, which Lisa here facilitated, and that was a very broad and robust undertaking, which things being different this round was not a feature of this year's update process. And as a result of my being the only person who was formally on the what's called the Policy Advisory Committee for the 2018 update, nominally representing that same constituency, I felt it necessary to broaden the reach and the number of voices. While I consider myself fairly capable in many respects, I don't know that I feel authorized to speak on behalf of everyone who would contribute the important insights into the new update. So that's partly what this is a hope to broaden the voices, and as I understand it, we have DWR staff here to whom I'm grateful to help present some advanced insight into upcoming portions of the plan. And I'd love to hear from Lisa or Mike or whoever's been tracking who's actually with us, so that we can know that and call those folks out as needed.
Yeah. So, Francisco, go ahead and let you know who's online.
So online we have Horatio Amezcua, Karen Nelson, Lauren Miller, Len Rodriguez, Wally, and Tania Serta.
Great. Thank you.
We're expecting Sherry Norris also. She's RSVP'd, so she may be in the same loop you were in. Okay, we've kind of covered, so just what's happened since the plenary. For the, I noticed there's people online that maybe weren't involved in the plenary, so I'll give you a little recap of that. We pulled together, the plenary is the annual kind of convening of all the different water plan stakeholders that come from various sectors of the water community, and they may or may not have been involved in any formal group or any formal process. It's a fairly large gathering. We had well over 200 people there, approaching, I think it was like 256 or something, and we also had a pretty big online presence. One of the things that we did, and it was kind of an experiment, we threw a section in towards the end of the day, which is always deadly at a very long day. But towards the end of the day, it was sort of a DAC caucus. And one of the things that we were really struck by during that session was that there was a lot of really good input, and also it wasn't a representative group. And I think that's one of the things that Mike and Colin and I talked about afterwards is kind of who actually speaks for this community. It's not a monolithic community. There are a lot of different perspectives, and one size doesn't fit all. So how do we broaden that conversation a little bit? Another important thing that came out of the meeting was the idea that the water plan itself is going to be quite short relative to previous water plans. So one of the options that was offered was the idea that this group could provide white papers to augment different pieces or things where they felt either that it wasn't represented specifically in the planning process itself or in the actual plan, and or it is there, but it needs more explanation. So there's really room there for a lot of input. That seemed to be a way that the community could have a voice that really exceeded what the process itself allowed for. So one of the things that DWR has been open to is facilitating that, allowing me to help talk about that and work with you all. And I think you'll see that Paul's incredibly, and Lou as well, incredibly supportive of making sure that voice is present in this plan. Another thing that happened is the editor of the plan was in the room. His name is Bill O'Daly. And Bill was personally impacted by some of the conversation, and he has put as an editor's mantle on his editorial process and working with the staff a very consistent question that came out of that plenary, which is everyone represented in this language? Do people see themselves in this language? And you'll find out when Paul comes to talk about what he's been working on, same thing. We've even taken, there's some financial scenarios and things that have been run, and a consistent question that the staff have been posing to the consultants and really forcing the conversation: is there representation in this plan? Do we feel that that's there? So that, I would say, is a rather striking and important outcome from the plenary that maybe was outsized to what the actual event was. And I would say you were there as well. Is there anything else that you want to say about that?
No, not right now. No.
Okay, and I'll go ahead. The two of you that were there also, anything you'd like to say?
This is Mike Antos. I'm excited that Bill walked away hearing that. That was something that was really powerful in the room that day. Lots of people were making that case that there's room for the plan to still accomplish what the plan needs to accomplish, but do it in such a way that addresses everyone and can be everyone can see themselves as a member of the community that the plan serves. That's a really key piece.
Yeah, another key feature, which is probably replicated today of that earlier conversation, is that meetings like these are probably not the best venue to actually achieve the goals that we want to achieve.
Yeah.
There needs to be some other method, whether leveraging the network of relationships through IRWM or some other thing. This is not necessarily in keeping with environmental justice best practices. Having it at 9 a.m. worked out to be hard for me because we just started potty training for my 2-year-old. Stuff going on this morning. You know how that goes.
It's important.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think conversation about what that process should look like, reflecting on 2013, which was a far more involved process, this year, which is really streamlined, to give it a polite word, and then what comes next.
Great, thank you. And then, Lynn, I know you're on the line with us. I hope you're in a situation where you can open your mic, because I'd love for you to be able to hop in from the IRWM roundtable perspective. Okay. So with that, then another thing, again, that just in terms of the languaging and accessibility, part of it too, Bill's also been really talking about making it not a water-long document, and really trying to write in a tone and a perspective that is accessible to those that are not necessarily living in everyday water stuff. So that's the kind of the outcome of that. So with that, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Anacita and Emily. And you also had activities during the plenary, and then you've been busy. I know you guys have got a lot of stuff going on since as well. So
could we get the Colin number? Sherry Norris is trying to park
Sure.
and drive in. I see the online option, but is there a direct Colin number?
There is a number. She actually has to key it to get in, though.
Okay.
So she's just parking right now?
I believe so. I'll send her
Okay.
the online option.
Thank you. And it will work off of her, that will work off your phone.
Okay.
Cell phone, yeah.
That's one.
I got the phone.
Yeah, there's a phone there too.
Oh, it's here, right there on the screen.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is Emily Alhendry. I'll just go and start with just more of just like the logistics of what we did. Just to start for this year, we started kicking off convening with our tribal advisory committee. So we were fortunate that that was something we could continue from the previous update. Second, with Colin, we probably don't meet as often as the last, but we try to do what we can. So we, in terms of like leveraging resources, we've kind of combined our water plan advisory committee with our groundwater tribal advisory group. So we were able to do this regionally, thankfully, for the tribes who were generous enough to host our meetings. We made it up to Redding Rancheria in February, and then we were in Valley Center in April and Los Angeles in June. And then starting in August, we kicked off our Tribal Water Summit Planning Team meeting. So for many of you that from the last update, that's something we convene with the tribes to discuss high-level policy issues. We do this every 5 years and concurrent with the water plant update so that the information that's being discussed and shared would be part of the proceedings. So that kicked off in August, and that group meets just via webinar every other week. That's kind of where we are now. And I think we're feeling the same way in terms of your comments about the streamline process, because obviously that was the big approach in 09 and 13 with the water plan update. And I do think that, there's if not for DWR's effects and commitment in 05 to create a tribal communication committee as part of the California water plan update, and the 09 engagement and 13 engagement, which actually developed the Tribal Water Summit. So the 09 summit, the 13 summit, so we're really trying, our challenge is having a summit that carry in, meet the expectations that we have developed through the communities. And I think that's where we're at, is where DWR really, unfortunately, with the outside events, causing a budget crunch, we do have expectations from the community, not only the DAC EJ community, but the tribal community. So that's our challenge. And I do think, what we're doing here with the visioning, with the white papers, is a way to, it's not necessarily going to fill those voids, but I think, if you can put a positive spin on anything, is that DWR has been there. So the expectations are, what can we do now to do that? And I think this is a lesson learned in terms of just, when we do the next phasing of how to make sure that we don't lose that engagement, or, we create these expectations and we fail on it. Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
I just wanted to reflect on the interplay between process, which is where we spent most of our time introducing this topic this morning, and substance, because part of the concern about not having the process is that it'll affect the substance, and potentially systematically to the detriment of marginalized communities like tribes and disadvantaged communities. I've heard it repeated more than once that the 2018 update is intended to be not necessarily a consensus document, but something where there's broad appeal. And given the way in which environmental justice and tribes generally approach the history of water allocation, policy, ownership, et cetera, in California, to the degree that challenges to the status quo are seen as aberrational or outside of that which can be readily agreed upon by a broad audience, that's the challenge that we face in this process. And this is at least a modest attempt to try to bring in those other voices and bring them into the mainstream to affect the substance.
Thank you. All right. And anything else, or any questions, anything to? All right. Let's go ahead then and hop into Paul's discussion. And then I'll also, just as a follow-up, let you know, we will be getting into some discussion about this. I went ahead and pulled from the last, from the plenary, a list of the drivers, the state role, and one of the things that we wanted to do in the session today was actually sit down and beef this up a little bit with the perspective of the communities. and also talk about what we think the real value add equation is, the sort of added perspective. So that'll be a follow-up to Paul's session, but just so you're aware, that's kind of what we wanted to do with that conversation. We're also looking for some hard questions, and poking everything that you do today, we're going to be pulling into the funding workshop. So we wanted to meet here first, hear any concerns so that they can be properly reflected in that larger conversation, which I know I'm talking insider baseball, but everybody in this conversation is an insider. So, but as you know, there's quite a bit of dissension right now about the idea of some water fees and things like that. And the water plan will be moving forward with some of those conversations. So our hope is that this community can really help us fine tune whatever that conversation looks like. So Paul?
Yeah, thanks for the lead in. And before I jump into the content I plan to share, I'll just underscore the importance of this worksheet and the activity that we have queued up today as well. In the plenary, one thing we did also was...
If you're online, we'll actually put the worksheet up so you can see it. Just so if you're online, or do you want to have it closed? Okay, Francisco will pull it up just so you can look at it real fast. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
So one thing we did at the plenary, I believe it was one of the first activities, we engaged the group on a discussion regarding the state's role in water management, what it is and what it can be going forward. And obviously it's complex. There's contractual obligations, there's mandates, statutes, and so on. But what's important here is the making the case going forward for the role of state government, where it's uniquely positioned to do things, and then the value added. That's essential in order to make the case for the funding recommendations. If we don't nail the value added, the value proposition, it makes it very difficult to suggest additional investment, much less more novel mechanisms that tend to be quite controversial.
So this is Mike, if you don't mind me jumping in. So I helped write the purpose of our meeting today, right? And that's to understand how DWR expects the plan to support and serve the communities, right? And what I find really interesting in the state role document we were just looking at is that both equity and justice appear nowhere in it, either as a driver or a role. Or I don't in this document.
It's the top one, first one.
What's that?
It's the first one.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I skimmed past it too fast.
Yeah, no,
I'm glad that it's there.
It's actually the first one.
No, I appreciate that, Lisa. Sorry about that. I skimmed past this document. I did not see it right away. So
yeah. Well, I just want to say though, it wasn't in the original. It was not in the original driver's language. That was the direct result of Colin.
That's fantastic.
In the plenary, raising it, and then from that, the conversation evolved. So that was partly what we were just talking about, the impact of the plenary, just the staff, and those of you who haven't worked with the water plant a lot don't necessarily know this, but the water plant staff really pay attention to what the stakeholders say, and so that was a key message that came out of that conversation. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, and I would just suggest that none of this is particularly etched in stone. Even that first column, are there missing drivers in addition to what we just identified? So that's part of the conversation that we'll engage in.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna lean on my 3:20 a.m. wake up call today.
Yeah, you're good. You're good, and maybe it also means maybe it wasn't written strongly enough.
Yeah.
So that's a piece of feedback not to be concerned about. Okay.
All right. So just a bit of setup here. What we'd like to do today is offer a little bit of contextual piece. Some of it is a little bit of an overlap in some of the intro stuff from the plenary, so I'll go through that rather quickly. I think most of the people on the call in here were there, but for the sake of those that were not, I'll touch on the context, and then more importantly, delve into, I guess I would call it kind of a cross-section of DAC tribal-related content from the emerging plan. And I underscore the word emerging because we're in between drafts right now of the document itself. We're incorporating the plenary comments, so I don't have a draft to share this week. However, next week there will be a draft available at the funding workshop of all the chapters. So I thought I would spare you the marked up midstream documents as they currently stand. Instead, I thought we can engage engage in kind of, as Lisa said, a roll up our sleeves discussion of this cross-section of content. I will offer a walkthrough on the screen of 2 chapters, but again, they'll be available next week, next Monday, November 20th. So just to kind of step through a few slides and synopsis of some of the content. Okay, thank you. Right. So just to, again, bring kind of to the forefront of our discussion, our mindfulness here is that piecemeal, strategy-specific, project-specific activities are not what the water plan is promoting per se as the key to sustainability. In fact, in lieu of that, we're proposing a much broader approach to water management, a much more inclusive approach, and a much more proactive approach. So we'd like to reaffirm that message, even though some of you may have seen this up to a half a dozen times, so I apologize for that. But
you really can't see that picture too often.
This one you can't see. Yeah, so one of the key messages of the water plan, and we talked about this at the plenary, is that it requires a balance of all the things I just described, a balance of a holistic, broad, multifaceted planning approach. And to kind of bring that into context specifically when I refer to balance, there's a lot of considerations in play, as we all know, and the water plan seeks to cast a broad enough net to encompass all of those facets of water planning and water strategies. And so we feel that this framing of sustainability is a step in that direction. These 4, so what we call societal values, are intended to encompass, including enriching experiences, which I like to point out is much more than what some might perceive as recreation, water-based recreation. It includes sustaining cultural activities related to water, cultural and religious activities, as well as the more spiritual activities involved with engaging in natural resources. Sustainability, and this is also, by the way, these 3 key slides with the dramatic photos are intended to reframe the conversation of water management, which I think is a key first step in creating an effective strategic plan. So long view, we're promoting and creating strategies and messaging around taking the long view from a planning perspective, and I'll elaborate on that here in a minute. And then the other thing is there's some foundational impediments, I'll say, to sustainability, and examples are the way we make decisions, the way we regulate. It's not an indictment of the regulators or the decision makers, but statutes and single species, for example, focus in environmental regulation. Opportunities to create a more broad-based planning and integrated management for things like decision making, decision support, data planning, engagement with various communities, including underrepresented and disadvantaged communities and tribal and tribes. So there's some core, what we call enabling conditions that we're proposing we focus on, and we call them priorities, and I'll explain that in just a second for Update 2018. Priorities that will enable us to better manage water. So you can see how we're elevating the conversation above that project-specific, reactive type of conversation space in water management. So I talked about priorities. One of them is operationally describing sustainability and tying them to those 4 societal values that I showed you. And then the priorities. These are the 5 priorities for Update 2018. In a big way, they key off of the much broader, we had 17 objectives and 350 recommendations in Update 2013. Implementability became a little challenging, as you might imagine, and there are things since then that have been identified as the most pressing issues. Oh, yes, please.
Colin here, just quick request of you, Paul, since I think Sherry at least is not watching this online.
Oh.
You have slides like this, could you quickly rattle off what's there?
Certainly, thank you for that.
Sherry's online.
Oh, she is online?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she's at home or online. Great, thank you.
Thank you. So these are the areas of concentration for the water plan and framing up what the challenges are in a very foundational way. we do highlight what we call the critical challenges associated or resulting from this, things like groundwater overdraft and so on. But again, the key focus for 2018 is to broach and provide implementable solutions for these 5 priorities. And that's part of the rationale also for, if we call it streamlining or focusing or sharpening the messaging of 2018. That said, we don't want to lose the perspectives and momentum we had from prior water plans regarding engagement and representation of disadvantaged communities and their plights and solutions in the water plan. That's why we're here today, obviously. Oops. Thank you. So sharper, more focused water plan focused on the priorities. We're needing to be aligned with the Governor's Water Action Plan. And we have a storyline that I'll share with you in Chapter 1 that kind of walks through that. And it's also the integration of these plans has been enhanced as a result of the comments we had heard at the plenary as well. We'll talk more about that later. I kind of talked about this, the highlights, the operational description, as I like to say, of sustainability, a long-term vision articulated to inspire and motivate, and to create that common vision that we can all get behind. And I think it is kind of gelling based on the comments we heard at the plenary. That long-term vision is coming together nicely. Identifying the gaps, and that gets into the priorities that I talked about, the foundational challenges. Actionable recommendations, I would say an actionable number of recommendations as well. So things to implement, we're saying, need to be at least broached and initiated in the next 5 years. So I'm emphasizing kind of a 5-year approach, not unlike the Governor's Water Action Plan, I might add. So continuing in that vein. And of course, funding, broaching that in the most meaningful way for the first time in the water plan, and then an implementation plan and a way to track performance. This isn't quite legible, but the point here is just that these are how the 5 chapters are arranged: the flow of information, establishing a vision for sustainability in Chapter 1, which I'll give you a little walkthrough of the latest draft, and then the sustainability outlook is a new framework/tool to help us consistently and concisely and effectively report on are we on the right path towards sustainability? Where are the gaps that are occurring? So where are we off track? That helps us recalibrate the recommendations, and on a recurring basis going forward with subsequent water plans, by the way. So it offers that consistency going forward. Chapter 3, recommended actions for sustainability. That gets right down to the actions recommended in the update itself.
And then you said you were able to pull some of the DAC tribal recommendations. Okay, great.
I have them. I have some slides with them paraphrased. They're not. I don't believe there are any different or new ones from the plenary draft yet. So, but again, we can talk about those and just where there are opportunities to evolve them or add or change. So Chapter 4 frames up the types of methods available to pay for the recommendations in Chapter 3. And then Chapter 5 recommends the methods for paying for Chapter 3, and it provides an implementation timeline. It identifies the implementers on the hook and what they need to do in that timeline. So that's the flow of logic from end to end of the water plan.
And then as a note, the Chapter 5 author is Jose. And Paul's the Chapter 4 author plus the overview author. So they're the 2 folks in the room today working on that.
So what I thought I would offer is just a walkthrough of so many of you have probably seen, and actually a lot of you have commented on the plenary draft. This Chapter 1 has been evolved, and I can flag where the changes are, and I'm really interested in hearing from you all whether this is on the right track, this Chapter 1. Some of the new stuff is in response to comments we heard, and some of it's just from evolving conversations that we've had since then.
And then I know you and I talked about whether or not you felt comfortable letting this one out today. Where are you at on that?
I think we can post. I think I had another couple of cleanups I can post it after this meeting if that works for folks.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think,
Yeah.
I think the group will see some changes based on what you've heard. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll flag those. So I won't do a full-on end-to-end, so I'll spare you. But again, I think there's some important changes that I'm hoping you'll find to be to add value to this chapter. So again, the purpose of this chapter is really to inspire and motivate and frame. So we frame sustainability, we inspire action based on a common vision, and then we motivate action based on that inspiration. So chapter 1, I think, is this the marked up, or actually I can, they're both moving the, no markup. So just a quick walkthrough on this. The beginning of this chapter really frames what's at stake, and not from a kind of a mechanical, things we do with water are in jeopardy, but more of a visceral kind of emotional. This is what we as Californians value most, and that's at stake. Particularly the world-class natural resources, the way that our natural resources, water resources, sustain diversity of ways of life, and so on. So it's really meant to kind of be a guttural depiction of what's at stake. And then we go into, however, there are vulnerabilities based on things like drought and flood. So what we call the tale of two extremes. So I won't go into that. That's pretty intuitive, and that hasn't really been updated. The consequences of the extreme events are described, the fact that they'll be exacerbated going forward by things like climate change and land and water use patterns, land use patterns. And then certainly an affirmation of the state's commitment to statewide sustainability, which again, I differentiate from more of a regional, local scale sustainability. And we can talk about in a minute how that rolls up and how we intend it to roll up to a statewide scale, and how the state is uniquely positioned to track and report on and help manage statewide sustainability. Albeit it is the aggregate of local and regional, so I want to get that acknowledgement in there as well. But the reaffirmation of the state's commitment to sustainability. So this is a little bit of background on the water plan, some fairly standard language about the water plan's evolution, some of the more recent, the drought and the fact that we had the wettest year on record following one of the most significant droughts in history. So elaborating on the tale of two extremes. We talk about a bunch of plans and initiatives that are really important going forward, and the fact that the water plan needs to dovetail and leverage and advance these activities. That's fancy jargon for saying the plans need to be aligned with the important initiatives that are ongoing now, as well as what's going to occur going forward. So, move on to the next page.
Question there, Paul?
Yes, please.
In that Prop 1 bullet, I was trying to read real quick. It references the passage.
Scroll back up.
Scroll back up just a little bit.
The top.
Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it would be valuable to include that Proposition 1 resulted in the 2016 Irwin Plan Standards. And the reason why I mentioned that, I mean, I know long-term DWR is thinking about connecting those two dots, and I think because those standards are plans that are being worked on all across the state right now by everybody. And I'm wondering if maybe there's somewhere else that comes in the plan.
You know, I mean, we're in the process of editing. Can I trouble you, Francisco, to jot down a note regarding the 2016? Maybe you can phrase it as you did so succinctly what you said.
And then would it be easier for you to just send an email with suggested text?
Yeah, I could certainly do that, yeah.
Okay.
That would be really helpful.
I think that's the most direct way to get.
Yeah, especially since you know in your head what it should say.
So yeah, good timing.
What page is that?
H2. H2.
Thank you.
All right. So this next set of bullets really frames kind of the most pressing issues occurring now in California, and it's a setup to the priorities for ultimately for the priorities for Update 2018. So that's the storyline, if you will. There's a lot of people. There are a lot of people at risk. A lot of people and stuff at risk. in California from flooding, and so on. These are not surprises to those of us and you all who have been in the water world for some time. But it's worth reiterating, and it's meant to focus the conversation on the things that are most pressing. In contrast to what we did for 2018, where we really wanted to capture the entire universe of everything that everyone in the water sector is particularly losing sleep over, so to speak. So this is a sharpened message on that.
And then just to note for both the tribal participants as well as the DAC, that you really want to make sure you see yourself in those bullets. So maybe we can scroll back up. These are kind of the drivers that are going to really drive the priorities of the plan. So I'm going to flag for everyone, take a close look at that language, and just, and no particular community is called out here, but is it articulated, are the drivers articulated in such a way that your community is present in the conversation? So that's just when you get that draft back, just to look at that, because this is key to how the whole rest of the plan is constructed.
What does that final bullet mean?
Oh.
It says the state of California has no durable process for prioritizing and funding public benefits and local regional assistance associated with water management and ecosystem protection.
In short, it means there's no state IWM investment strategy that exists, and that can probably be worded more clearly.
Yeah.
And that's the niche that, again, Update 2018 is making strides to fill in. So.
It's interesting, the thing that I failed to read earlier, right? Income and economic inequality is the driver. And, the tale of two extremes could very easily point at income inequality too, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if all these things are stitched together as tightly as they could be. I guess maybe it's something for me to look at when I have a chance to look at the whole document.
Right, and that's the part too where I just want to have everyone pay attention to that. There is some language in there that's kind of touching on it, but this is not the time to be ambiguous or subtle. So.
Yeah, to wit, and this is Colin, I think I made the comment at the very first Policy Advisory Committee meeting for 2018 update that in the kind of overall, the big picture framing of societal values, though an argument can be made that, equity is embedded and cuts across all of the others listed, we very well could have, and in my view should have, had a separate prong of which was dedicated specifically to that. What we used to call in the heyday equal opportunity, but has fallen in disfavor as savage capitalism has found its resurgence in many manifestations. I would like to see it, really called out here and be an overarching theme, a thesis statement that, as Mike suggests, finds its path throughout.
So I will note that is charged language.
Am I known for anything less?
Indeed, which is why I am enjoying the conversation. So that's, I think, and just so you're aware, there was a massive staff discussion about that. That is.
I'm sorry to hear that the people on my side lost.
I think it's helpful to raise it again. But that is a conversation that was held at length, and there was different reasons, like you said, the embeddedness and that kind of thing. But this, I think, is a really good opportunity. This is the driver right here. These are the priorities. And also maybe we re-raise the additional comment. Go ahead, Anastasia.
Yeah, along that thought process, my comments are, what about the terminology of parity? And I don't see that as a thought process. I know it's there in the background, but I think calling out that because, even in our, legislative mandates, we're seeing more of that in terms of and it's not necessarily the affirmation of, we're committed to, it's, what is the real commitment, and we're seeing this, especially in strides were made in terms of the parity for tribes. The perspective is, the parity is that now they're at the table in order to receive eligibility for grants, but that's one part of that. But the other parity is when you're talking about two extremes, not necessarily flood and drought, but the extremes of inequality and equity with income, and how that is lack of access.
And I mean, we're talking about really, emboldening these words, addressing that, or where would that fit into that?
That's something to be considered. And also, so let me just add something else on top of that. So in the last water plan, one of the things that you guys collectively, I say you guys meaning the stakeholders, brought forward was the incorporation of the human right to water legislation, and that was adopted and referenced in the plan. And that's been kind of a proxy for this conversation, but it isn't really a proxy for the conversation. So let's just struggle with that a little bit. Let's just play around with that. I want to just throw that out for people's thinking, and we can figure out what to do about it. And if we go down the parity economic road, you all know that's gonna be a big conversation, and that's good. That's a good thing.
One more comment and then we move on, but I was just going to say that I agree with that statement, Lisa, that the human right to water has become an imperfect proxy because by its own terms, it is substantively too narrow to address the broader set of issues for tribes and other disadvantaged community issues with respect to ecosystem service. I mean, just a whole range of things to grapple with, I think, to reiterate my earlier point, through that frame. And I know DWR tires of this comparison, but let me make it once more, and that is that the State Water Board has a process by which a board makes pronouncements in the form of resolutions, which do incrementally have their impact on staff work product, institutional culture, et cetera. This board has adopted environmental justice resolutions, adopting, real clear instructions for staff to make sure that's a key consideration across all of its programs. It was earlier this year integrated into the enforcement policy of the State Water Board Office of Enforcement. Similarly, a human right to water resolution, which says we apply it to all of our activities. The DWR doesn't really have the same type of mechanism for that. I would propose that the State Water Plan is one such important venue for making such pronouncements to guide at least internal cultural institutional change, if not broader change throughout the water sector at large.
So hearing that, how do you find a way to process that? Like, does that fit with what you're thinking about, or is that kind of a one-off from where you've been?
I mean,
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No.
Okay.
The extent to which it's DWR specific, maybe more effective in a, we intend to be off of the recommendations in this broader state government plan with a DWR implementation plan for update 2018. So in the programmatic sense for the water plan within this department, we can move that ball forward in our implementation plan. That's just one thought off the cuff opportunity. We can frame it, I think, more broadly for state government in this plan, and I don't know if we're going to go so far as a recommendation. We can bear that in mind when we get in talking about recommendations in Chapter 3 as well, to institutionalize environmental justice.
Colin, is there something like constitutional, something bigger than DWR they can lean on to assert that the efforts are that the state's interest is equity? Right, rather than having to claim it their own mission, if that makes them uncomfortable, they can say that it's the state's mission and they are therefore trying to achieve it.
Good question, Mike. There are a whole host of statutes and laws stemming from the heyday of anti-discrimination, which there's a long list which we could provide, and I think those collectively and many individually would provide plenty of justification for DWR to hang its hat on. There's probably some element, depending on what those recommendations are, if we're going to say, reparations and repatriation of the California Indian tribes, I would certainly endorse that. I don't know that's going to make its way into the plan, but there'll have to be some tethering between what the recommendations are and what justification for them would be marshaled.
Because it would seem to me like the state, that you could argue that California has an interest in achieving equity. I mean, more broadly than water, I'm just talking about generally, right? And I think the state would there's probably ways to assert that the state knows that already. And the question is whether we could weave that in.
Jose, I'm sorry. let's look at this. Jose, you've done a lot of thinking on this. Is there anything that's triggering for you while we're having this conversation?
Well, no, I'm just looking at these key issues again, and what, I scroll back up, I guess, to see what feeds into them again. Maybe we should definitely,
How far do you?
that's,
Up to the bullets, the other bullets?
That's probably good.
This describes the initiatives, and then this begins framing what some of the key challenges.
But, I mean, I see flood, ecosystems, groundwater, water management, climate change. I mean, I think DAC is definitely.
Can be called out here specifically.
Yeah, anywhere in that list. I mean,
Yeah.
as far as where you want to put it, I think we definitely need to.
I think the bullets are reactive versus proactive. You know, and maybe something that would be a bullet that is actually more of a proactive after this or in the beginning, because if you look at that, you know, we're still responding,
Yeah.
you know, to the effects that we're so well aware of.
And now, anybody on the phone, we'd love to hear from you. Just raise your hand. We'll open your mic or chat. If you chat with Francisco, he'll track that. But he'll be happy to read whatever you write. So please, if you're on the line, we'd love to hear from you. Paul?
I was just going to say too, offhand, another opportunity, maybe it's in the DWR implementation plan, maybe it's in the water plan, is updating of our strategic business plan is an opportunity to institutionalize that as well. I mean, we are on a cycle with that plan, but I think that's important to kind of keep in play as we launch into the next update, which is actually a few years out, I would expect. However, something I think it's a great, that does shape our institutional priorities and the way we do business.
Okay. And I jumped in and started a conversation. Do you want to keep going?
On the walkthrough? Or,
Yeah,
okay.
let's do that.
Sure.
This just seemed like an important section. So.
Yeah. So then, what we jump into is begin painting a picture of what sustainability looks like, and particularly in terms of the long view. But one thing I did add prior to that, in this context of managing for water resources sustainability, how we talk about everybody has a stake, and that, you know, sustainability is a dynamic balance and so on. And we do a little bit more connectivity, kind of nexus with the water action plan, with the overlapping goals and framing of sustainability. I added this section. I'm particularly interested in hearing what you all how you all feel about it. So I think we needed to strengthen our message and our commitment to state regional alignment, and have enough specificity to actually be meaningful. It's easy to talk about it as an ideal. It's easy to talk in abstract on how useful it is to accomplish. But to me, it became fairly important to be more succinct, more deliberate, and more clear with this message. So I don't know if you're willing and able to it's 3 paragraphs. And again, if you're not interested in reading through it at this moment, you can kind of just get the gist. And what we're saying is that, you know, we can't accomplish statewide sustainability from a top-down approach because it can never be more than the aggregate of local and regional conditions. So we want to acknowledge that up front. And that being the case, the management activities need to occur at a regional scale because that's their jurisdictions, their priorities, their individual charges and missions, very place-based, so a lot of geographical variability and so on. I'm preaching to the choir here, so identifying that and acknowledging it up front was important. And that sets up our message and the water plan is one of the key, I'll say objectives, is to empower and strengthen regional planning and identifying how state government can accomplish that. That's what that first paragraph talks about. At the same time, things are complex. So integration at one scale across the state is easier said than done. And there is typically no one-size-fits-all. Watershed, river basin, IRWM region, for example. So all we're saying here is that given the complexities of the different planning scales and the necessity, by the way, to plan at different scales, if you're managing an aquifer, if you're a GSA, it's necessary to speak in terms of your aquifer. At the same time, there's a bigger picture where everything's connected, like the watershed, or interregionally, because things are connected in a big way in California. So it's setting the stage for supporting a meaningful discussion on the appropriateness of regional scales and empowerment of regional entities to achieve sustainability. I'll give some examples of what I just talked about. The fact that, if you're fish and flood tends to make a lot of sense at a watershed scale. Flood modeling, flood management, fisheries habitat tends to occur at a watershed scale. Groundwater management I talked about, and then the critters. Critters aren't necessarily watershed
DWR technical term.
specific. Yeah, I'm getting highly technical here. Terrestrial critters, non-fish, don't necessarily align with watersheds. So there's a need to consider ecoregions. And I know we all know this, but I wanted to make sure that this is strung together. This is useful content in this chapter, and it's articulated in a way that is helpful for the story that we're telling.
I've got a comment. Can we also bookmark bullet 2, groundwater management and aquifer scale? We've been hearing from the tribal communities with groundwater under Sigma beyond just an aquifer scale, in terms of more than just what's there, in terms of watershed, in terms of interrelated basins. So it's for tribal communities, it is larger. And so Emily, maybe we can make some suggestions, and we're having a tribal advisory group on groundwater, and so we can point out this bullet to see if that's something we're comfortable with, but I imagine not comfortable with. I think it's too narrow.
Yes, and what I'm hoping is not the case, is that this is not intended to frame up new silos. What it's doing is just illustrating the physical realities on the ground, and then really the takeaway is this, 2 sentences, 3 sentences? All these things need to be coordinated among entities at all these scales, and IRWM, Sigma, municipalities, to most effectively manage at, let's say, a watershed scale, really need to be aligned. And in many areas, we also give I guess you might call it a position on the engagement of our regional water management groups going forward. We're suggesting in most areas of the state, they're tending to be best positioned to work on integration across these things, at least well positioned in most areas of the state. For things that are occurring now, Sigma, some near-term initiatives, new legislation in a year or two that necessitates management across these scales, and to advance the conversation of, are there better ways to align ourselves down the road, 10, 20 years down the road? That's where we can bring in the more definitive discussions on watershed-based management and governance. But what I'm trying to set up here is an and both discussion. I think prior drafts of the water plan, I'll speak frankly, kind of led with this whole watershed river basin. Let's do something different very soon and recalibrate governance. And I think what we needed to do was kind of an and both. For the immediate term, we have some really well-positioned groups and entities that there's been a lot of investment in that we need to leverage. And we need to engage those groups in brainstorming strategies going forward for watershed-based management and other regional governance strategies.
The term alignment is very important on this too. It's not integrating these things, because everybody wants, in some ways, they're more comfortable staying in their silos, if you will. But aligning those things doesn't necessarily imply anybody giving up their authority that they might have right now, but they're aligning amongst these things right now. I think that's an important distinction to say, is how we're talking about at this point. There is some angst in the Sigma. You brought up the Sigma.
If you're online, this is Lou talking. Go ahead.
Sorry. But Sigma does have some angst of, losing control of what they've got here. I'm speaking based on Paul's going rogue there too. So At any rate, I mean, there is that concern that,
Megan?
you know, they have a job to do, they have
Yes,
authority, they don't want to lose or dilute
Have a
that
comment?
authority and
No, I
that
mean,
drive that they
she
have
just said
right
that they
now.
will have a fire.
But there is still also a need to align those things with the things as well. So I'm just highlighting that in there. This is very consistent with what we heard in the plenary and the sessions that Mike Floyd and I and Lynn Rodriguez on the phone here as well had kind of brought forth. And I think that the idea of scale is also that there's no right scale. I think that was actually a term, you know, addressed in our plenary session, as well as that somebody had mentioned, you know, different scales for different things. I go back to the old different strokes for different folks, I guess, you know, the old saying. But, you know, there is logic to those scales for different purposes, and we have to have all of them.
So I want to actually go back real quickly before we lose it to Anastasia comment, and I'm going to repeat what I think you said, and I just want to see if it's right. I think you were talking about there's a need to incorporate habitation scales and maybe heritage.
Not necessarily. I think that's generally there, but more so because what we're seeing as potential conflicts with groundwater management is, you know, maybe even semantically just saying groundwater management beyond the aquifer scale, because tribes that do not have a direct, you know, basin alignment because they may be non-federally recognized, still have an ancestral tie to maybe an upper basin, upper watershed that would affect that groundwater. Right. So they want to be part of the water budgeting. They want to be part of that conversation. And so we're seeing that potential discussion when you're dealing with the sustainable plans.
So yeah, that was what I was the word then. So it's an ancestral scale because there's a sort of a connectivity piece.
And and every potential groundwater is going to have it's going to be very different. Right, and I just think that when we keep it that way, water managers who the GSAs who cannot have tribes cannot be a GSA, who are dealing with groundwater management and developing sustainable plans, you know, they need to think beyond just the aquifer scale. Right, and that's what we're hearing.
Which does have some legal import.
Yes.
With respect to consultation under CEQA, AB 52, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that for me that actually triggers. And I'm going to just ask the group to indulge me just with my park ranger brain. But that particular scale is actually worth calling out as a specific scale because the whole context of a relationship of humans and waterscape is not part of our normal nomenclature. So let's just play with that a little bit, and it gets down to some habitation scales too. I have some other people in the room that know more about this than I do, but so for example, some of the settlement pattern kinds of scaling has created some of the drivers around how we're managing. So I just want to flag that on notes, and we'll come back and play with that a little bit. But thank you for those words. That's really informing. Thank you.
So water and culture resource management strategy might be tied to this conversation.
Yes. Yeah, there's pieces of that, and you know, that's something when we come back to talk about maybe the white paper. So one of the things that Lou's in charge of overseeing that, but the idea of if there are updates to the RM resource management strategy. So that might be something to think about as we talk about what the next step of the committee work would be, or the summit work, perhaps, something like that. So anyway, thank you, Anastasia. I just didn't want to lose what you said. Yeah.
Oh, please.
I was just going to make one comment, reflecting on this section and some of my earlier comments about, in my view, the need to really grapple with the equity, justice, parity, however we're going to phrase it, component. I continue to come back to it really needs to be outlined as one of the societal values around which the document itself is framed. And this, again, highlights that for me, because they say brevity is, you know, a virtue, but there's almost a necessary level of abstraction that comes from that brevity. And in that abstraction, we default to a lot of the cliches about, you know, sustainability for all, which in practice in the field, when you come at sustainability, the EJ folks will ask, sustainable for whom? Because, Horacio's on the line, the farm worker housing cooperative in which he lives is in a very different posture with respect to the waterscape and the water rights that attach to it. For example, the state water project than say, Westlands Water District, which, I think that's important to call out and actually give it some attention, not least of reason which that as we're looking at the drivers, of where we add value, I can't believe I failed to mention this in the plenary, but the single largest driver in my mind is history. It's where we've been, right? It's a history of genocide and dispossession. It's a history of racial apartheid and formal discrimination, of sorting people into communities of haves and have-nots, with which we are still living very much today, and which determine the fate of and futures of people with respect to a whole range of opportunities, water not being least among them. And I think it's an important piece to grapple with, certainly in the framing, but also throughout.
Okay. And along that line, and the work planning drivers, there's population. That could be expanded in terms of,
Yeah.
Where people are, what brought them there, and,
Yeah,
expanding.
I hadn't really even flagged that myself until you started talking about it. But the whole idea, and I'm looking over at Mike because our geography PhD, and I'm sure we've got some anthropologists that can hang out with us as well. But these are huge issues, and that gets back to this history conversation about these habitation patterns are massive drivers, and then we look at the scales at which we plan, which are oftentimes derived from that. So anyway, I had not mentioned that before, and I asked your indulgence because I'm supposed to be a neutral and not talk, but go ahead.
So one takeaway I'm getting too from this conversation is we can probably make this more clear, because the point is, I think, consistent with what Anna C. was saying, but it may not pop, right, is things need to be managed at different scales, and more importantly, all that needs to be coordinated at the appropriate scale. And that's what this is trying to set up, as opposed to it may come across initially as, floods should immerse themselves at just a watershed scale, and that's it. But what it's suggesting is that all this needs to be aligned. You have to manage it at a watershed, aquifer, ecoregion scale, and it needs to be integrated at the.
You have some real whiz-bang graphics people, because this to me begs to be a good graphic depiction, because honestly, right, fish and flood management may both be most effective at the watershed scale, but you impact groundwater management, your terrestrial ecosystem impacts your groundwater, as does your flood management, or so.
That's a good.
Figuring out a way to show how these scales are similar in the and what's nice about fish and flood, the fish and flood bullet, is that it's talking about two things that are managed by entirely separate people normally.
Right.
Might be good to figure out what other things are, what's the other pairings.
Yeah.
Have these all be pairings to help challenge people to think, oh wait, those are both at the same scale, right?
Yeah.
Like terrestrial ecosystems and land use.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay.
I'll keep you moving.
All right. Yeah. So I'll again just kind of hit on the.
Even though I'm the one interrupting.
The new stuff. So we
on the phone, or?
I know I keep checking. I'd love to hear from people, so please don't be shy. We're a very open-minded group, so feel free to let us know if you got an opinion. And Francisco, you don't have to talk either. You can type. Francisco will be happy to read anything you write, or we'll open your mic.
All right. So based on some of the plenary comments and a little bit of retooling of the vision, we've again changed the articulation a little bit of these the 5 themes, formerly called themes of water plan update 2018, to priorities. And I talked about that a little already in the slides. So we've recast that a little bit and emphasized it more in this long-term vision. And so this gets into what you were talking about, Colin, where we in an aspirational way, or in as an ideal, all Californians. And I hear what you're saying, that you're, just to be sure I'm hearing what you're saying, on a practical rubber meets the road sense, the ideal doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to be. It's
the actionability of the recommendations with respect to these will be hugely important.
okay. Thanks for clarifying. That's helpful.
Something that was mentioned at the plenary is that currently it doesn't seem like the report admits that the challenges are faced disproportionately by people who are overburdened by pollution or low income or whatever, and that to achieve these things, some people need a stronger lift than others, right? And I think that'd be important to get in here somehow.
That's good, and I think that's consistent with your earlier comment about there's two dimensions to the tale of two extremes, the physical and the social, so to speak. That's a good point. Okay. So again, we kind of key in the vision to the 5 priorities of 2018. The language has changed a little bit in some of the descriptions. We've kind of re-articulated this in terms of a vision. Shared intent is identified. Governments are aligned, kind of the affirmative type language, and other improved regulation. So a lot of the messages in here are similar to what the plenary draft showed. We did, again, as I said, take every opportunity to call out, every opportunity we've observed thus far to maintain the nexus with the Governor's Water Action Plan.
I know. Can you just stop at that earlier bullet? I know it's something that we're always grappling with our editors. The tribes have always asked, please capitalize tribe when you can, because when you're saying tribal in its undercase, you're talking more of the concept versus tribal capitalized means we are speaking specifically to a government.
Okay, we'll pass that along to our editor. So provide knowledge and data. So these just are intended to identify the vision associated with each of the priorities in a way that resonates in terms of the benefits, the type of benefits and outcomes that can occur. It's not only kind of painting a picture of the desirability of this vision, but also what is occurring in order to enable that. So, for regulation, it was increased, what did we call it? Increased discretion is available and exercised. For example, alternative compliance pathways, setting up the recommendations ultimately in Chapter 3. So the vision was changed a little bit, and again, all the chapters will be available on Monday, and we can send it out even to this group as well if you are unable to attend.
Can I see regulations once more?
Sure.
Because the earlier conversation we had about institutionalizing mechanisms, is there a chance or some? I know this one really just sort of like defaulting to the Water Action Plan, and I don't know whether that Water Action Plan will be alive in 2023 or between 18 to 20. Yeah. And so is there something there, because this is the handbook that's going to be part of that bridge.
Yeah.
In terms of that, I don't know if that's there's a chance here to take advantage of that opportunity for more of a bridge to whatever are going to be future regulations.
Do you have some ideas of what kinds of language are?
Not necessarily, but based on what Colin mentioned earlier, of that we don't have at DWR that regulatory power, such as crafting resolutions that Water Board does, but also that we are kind of, because of the Water Action Plan as being the big framing document, and we're using this as improving regulation. I want to be more futuristic in terms of just, how then do we leverage what the water plan is doing now within whatever new regulations, or how it also can assist in improving regulations. Because if the Water Action Plan kind of takes a slow death, then their drivers are going to look at this bullet and say, this is what the water plan update with its stakeholders said, this is how we can improve regulations. I don't want to lose that opportunity if we can strengthen it here.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say our intent is not to defer to the action plan, so hopefully, maybe we need to rephrase this too, but we're signaling consistency and we want to evolve, and we've kind of called it almost an evergreening of the action plan through the water plan update process, which obviously in statute enables us to do that more consistently even across administrations. So yes, we want to convey that.
And that is an opportunity, by the way, that it's not uncommon for the things in the plan to roll up into statute. So you want to be strategic about how you place and how you frame, so that if there is interest in that, it can be leveraged and pulled out of it.
So one thing I just wanted to flag also, I added this paragraph, this section, actually this paragraph. This section was formerly titled, what, Evolution of the Water Plan?
Yeah.
Which, that's good to know as part of the context for this water plan. I wanted to make it a little more affirmative and a little more illustrative of what we want to do, like leverage past accomplishments and the value of doing that, the value of delivering on past commitments. So have it a little bit more punchy and a little bit more meaningful in terms of what we want to accomplish, as opposed to, I guess, in my view, a little more mechanical description of this is the last update, this is this one. And so the point is, building on the past accomplishments, the point this paragraph makes is really accomplishments and commitments are important to leverage and adhere to going forward. And this is why, right? For accomplishments, it's the best way to help ensure consistency. Consistency supports efficiency, and ultimately creating more effective policy going forward. I can point to the sustainability outlook in this case as an example of what this is referring to. If we can get the staying power of that outlook, we can create more efficiency and better policy going forward, and better policy conversations through a shared understanding of what's articulated for management needs and so on. Just as important, maybe more important, adhering to past commitments is the best way to sustain trust, to build trust in the process. And when we talk about the importance of partnerships, which I tried to hit on with that one section of the importance of regional alignment, trust is essential, obviously. So I just wanted to flag that as kind of state governments, or at least DWR's signaling of intent to sustain past commitments and deliver on them. That includes recommendations, to be specific, recommendations in Update 2013, for example. And then also minimizing stranded investment. That's kind of jargony, but there's been a lot of investment in things like IRWMs and regional water management groups and engagement, and leveraging that is essential to being efficient and garnering that trust and maintaining the trust that we refer to.
On that point, Paul, for IRWM, I don't recall if you were part of the conversation that the roundtable EJCW and Aqua had with Grant Davis, with Director Davis.
No, unfortunately.
There's a follow-up document that'll come from that,
Good.
Which will get presumably everyone's endorsement. You might want to look to that for some of the language around kind of not stranding IRWM specifically as an asset.
Okay, great.
And Lynn on the phone can put you in touch with that.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. Are you on that? Are you?
Well, we're also meeting on December 6th. Hopefully we can get there. But with Lynn and others to try to craft some more of the language in the water plan.
Okay.
Yeah, that's important.
Okay.
Right, good. I have one more comment as well, or an additional comment. Someone needs to jump on?
Yeah, it sounds like maybe somebody in their car, if you wanted to jump in. Is that you, Lynn?
No, I'm sorry, it's Sherry. I got unmuted. I'm putting myself back on mute.
Thanks for being here.
Drive safely.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So if someone were to read this, new manager, not very familiar with prior water plans, they're looking at like, wow, do I have to really read 2013 or 209? And they're looking at this. I mean, this is an opportunity to actually.
Only one human being who's actually read.
Yes.
Of course.
What are those leverage assets?
Yeah.
Because we're what are those leverage assets? And I know for, the tribal communities, the ability for DWR to assist with the Tribal Water Summit was really important, and that they gave a fine dive into some of those concerns that couldn't even be addressed in 2013 or 09. And it was also part of, the evolution of that community as being beyond a stakeholder status. So I don't know that we actually, when we're talking here, it's more like, we have done successful leveraging of assets to a certain degree. And so I don't know that for somebody very new to it, that we actually really spell it out. And if this is the right place or not. And even though, we've got a long way to go with DAC EJ, I do know that part of the whole visioning has been part and parcel to how we've evolved in the last every 5-year update. And so I just don't know that it really does, highlight it to say, and here's where you can go back. Because I'm talking to young people all the time who are talking about, I go back to this, go back to that. And it is. Our whole idea is to have these living archivals that's still there. And thank you, Mike, for mentioning the resource management strategy, because that was very important to the tribal community to be able to have a water and culture in 2013. And part of it is like, are we going to be able to do that again for 2018? And so I just don't know that we actually are successful from the DWR hat here I'm wearing, is saying, have we actually shown and highlighted where you can go find some of these leverage assets that can be improved, that are constantly being improved.
That's an excellent point. And the silver tsunami isn't helping with the loss of institutional knowledge as well. So, yeah, it'd be.
Do you reference an appendices document? Do you reference a potential white paper here? Do you reference, something? I don't know if this is going to be a lot of footnotes or not, but I do think that, there's a lot of, especially in DWR's commitment to.
Yeah.
This is, DWR has done this. So, and I'm always, trying to show that leveraging of how even the Water Summit's grown, how it's going to stay relevant.
Uh-huh. And you know what? We might hold that thought for Chapter 5 as well, as a place for progress tracking and posterity, where we intend to prepare an annual report on what has been implemented, where are the gaps that still occur, are there any tweaks to the recommendations that we think are necessary on an annual basis, perhaps addressing some of the kind of more front and center essential commitments that need to stay in play. Just kind of spitballing at this point, but I think that may be an opportunity we can talk about in Chapter 5 as well.
So we're actually, Lynn's trying to hop in. Lynn, if you do need to put your PIN in, so you just do a 75-pound or pound 75-pound. If that doesn't work, sometimes you just have to call back in if you got yourself cattywump in the system. That happens sometimes. But we'll open your mic as soon as we can pick you up. Okay. Go ahead.
Are we pausing for? Okay, so she'll jump in when she's ready.
She'll jump in. We're talking about IRWM. I'm sure she has something to say.
I think at this point, because I'm looking at the clock, and we know we want to get through Chapter 4 and the recommendations, paraphrased, of course. Maybe that's the extent of the really substantial new content to this chapter. So.
And it's pretty much picked up in this. You'll see. I'm hoping you all saw this reflected in that, and I'm also hoping you all saw how this document is transitioning. So this without offering editorial on, you can definitely see a progression of the document based with this version. So we'll come back to this one. We do want to get through the other content. I'll go ahead and let you jump into the rest of your slide set.
Just quickly, Paul, as Colin speaking, will the driver's document be reflected other than woven into the narrative, for example, in chart form?
You mean, will we?
Yeah, is this going to show up in the plan or maybe even as an appendix?
This would more likely show up in something like an appendix. It also, we can roll this stuff up into the plenary. I pulled this directly from the plenary notes. So this will also show up on the web page as a background document that we can reference.
Lincoln.
Oh, great.
And of course, our intent is to integrate this in a operational way throughout the document. If it's useful to summarize it, we can,
But
definitely
getting
be
back to
offended.
the white paper, this would be all something you could take and we could expand and put into the white paper as well. Especially because we'll add new content on value add. The first half is from the plenary. So I was really struck, and Paul and I talked about this yesterday when I went back and looked at the notes. I was like, oh, yeah, it was so consistent with what the staff had been thinking about. And Paul said at first he felt, would you say a megalomania or something?
Oh.
He's like, vindicated.
Yeah, it was consistent with I think where we were headed, and that was a good thing.
Yeah.
Not by coincidence. There's been lots of conversations.
We can revisit it, but I think I would anchor that discussion with a recommendation that this document continue to be refined, possibly adding some of the things we talked about today, history, demographics, and
Yeah.
find its way into the plan.
Yeah, let's take that, Kristen, if you could just flag that as an action item that we want to take this to the next step, the state roll doc. And then Lynn, go ahead, mic's open, hop in.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to jump in on what Colin said a few minutes ago about the letter, or the summary of the meeting that we had with Grant Davis last month, and reiterate that has a lot of good information relative to the water plan update, and that will be, I'm not sure how that's going to be circulated once it's finalized, but I just wanted to sort of echo what Colin said about that. And also at that meeting, we had a discussion from the three, we were sort of calling ourselves the Coalition of Coalitions, the EJCW, Aqua, and the Roundtable of Regions. We'll be having some follow-up conversations with DWR staff. And there were, I believe, we went through a process of getting some additional comments to you, to Paul and to Lou. And sorry to use this forum to ask you if you received anything from Tracy Hemeter yet.
Well, we had an initial one, but I'm wondering if you're saying that there was something more coming recent. We did get something from Tracy earlier, like weeks ago.
A few weeks ago?
Yeah, a few weeks ago.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that you received that.
Okay.
Okay. So in terms of next steps with that document, is that written as a public document, or what exactly is the document that you're preparing?
It's notes from the meeting, and I need to check with state staff to find out how public that can be.
So are you referring to what the summary that Mike put together?
Actually, Melissa Sparks from Aqua put it together, and then we've all commented. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, those are things that we can share with our listserv and things like, so we can share things like that if it's public. That's the question.
Yeah.
Well, if it came from Melissa and from you all adding in, we kind of need permission before we share it. But if you give us permission, whenever you feel ready, we will share it.
Yeah, we do have the ability to do that.
Yeah. Just a quick attorney note here: if it falls into DWR's hands, it's
public anyway.
It is public.
Yeah.
Public Records Act.
We do this out of
Right. So in this case, it would be a question of do we advertise it or broadly share it versus is it discoverable? Those are two different issues.
Sure.
So okay, because there's almost a form of endorsement, right? If a letter is extended to say the whole AC and the SASC and all the others groups coming from staff, there's sort of an implied endorsement of the content. So that's a separate discussion. All right, let's keep going. So Paul, you want to go back to your PowerPoint? What's best for you?
That's fine, yeah. So just kind of going in succession with the chapters, some of the key messages, and we can kind of go through this quickly. I'm a little concerned about time because we want to go through chapter 4 and we want to do this exercise on the worksheet. So we've all seen this, and we just talked about that for chapter 1. I think I kind of just covered this in the chapter 1 walkthrough. I'm just scanning to see if there's any messages that I hadn't conveyed already, and feel free to ask any questions as I speed through this. Okay. So we can't see this, but some of you, many
One of our
you,
tricks.
yeah,
Full transparency.
it worked well on my monitor, but in this case, it doesn't show. But the point is that getting into, this is in the Chapter 2 realm now of the sustainability outlook and the indicators and outcomes that are being developed. And this is where I would describe it as kind of where the rubber does meet the road in terms of, well, the substance behind the values, the societal values. And I can't work any magic to make that, and that's okay. I just, the indicators, and we can share these as well, so that we don't have to pour over them right now. Probably don't have time anyway. But the point is here that there's several indicators, and I can't read them myself, that pertain to basically, as a rule of thumb, everything that pertains to population as part of an indicator is intended to capture the entire breadth of the human condition across California. We can be more specific with more specific indicators. For example, Lou, are you able to read a couple of those that I circled that I now can't?
It says, the first one says population and percentage of, population and percentage of population on, without reliable domestic water supplies.
Okay, so that's the type of example of the emerging indicators. And then there's in the right-hand column, which we don't need to go into right now, there's even more specific reference to how that would be measured.
I'll mention one thing, is scale is very important on this as well. So we've got pilot projects, and we have a new one with SAPA that's coming up as well. So when you talk about these, this is at a statewide view, but when you get down to a more regionalized scale, looking at these indicators, you can actually start to discern things like, is this population a disadvantaged community as well? At a statewide scale, it's going to be mixed in there, and you're not going to be able to discern that kind of information out of it. So that's an important, consideration.
Thank you, Lou, and that underscores our other intent, which is really that the sustainability. I mentioned it earlier on. It's essential that the sustainability outlook, the indicators, they're applied at a local regional scale initially, and then the aggregate is what we would characterize as the statewide sustainability.
And then one of the outcomes in the plenary was that the group that was working on it, and it was the limitation of the plenary in that it was not a fully representative group. However, they really did start to focus on what are sort of the key indicators that the list needed to be succinct and tight enough that it was hitting on top line things. So the list, like other work products, it just keeps getting better and is iterative. The other thing, once you complete your review of the other chapters, you want to go back and backcast into it. So it kind of start here and roll into the rest of the plan and then go back. So everything will need to align with the recommendations and the indicators and the implementation plan. Everything's going to have to flow. So that'll be something to come back to, but it has been evolving as has the rest of the document.
The reason why I'm kind of pausing on this too is that, in my opinion, this is a real meaty, substantive opportunity to track, report on, and support policy decisions in terms of DAC tribal interests. We have, and that was part of the reason why part of the discussion was why not add a fifth societal value. Part of it was really the meaningfulness. First of all, it cut across all of them because everybody needs access to all of that stuff, the public health and safety and so on. And the real meat is, in staff's opinion, is really when we get down to the nitty-gritty. What are we measuring? How are we reporting it? And are we meaningfully translating that into policy? This affords us that opportunity if applied at a regional scale and, again, brought into the statewide policy conversations in a substantive way. And that's what 2018 is framing up.
One quick, this is Colin again, one quick note on that, which I may have mentioned before, is that for purpose of cross-agency alignment, or whatever we want to call that feature, at least on the drinking water side, I spoke with Lauren Zeiss, the head of Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, the other day, and though it's been laggard in its approach, there is an effort there to establish indicators for the human right to water, which are in keeping with the work OE has done on Cal and Viroscreen and other kind of data collection and mapping. It would be nice to dovetail those. I'm not confident I know when that's going to proceed because it's been, again, slow.
Yeah.
But it might be something that could be incorporated by reference, something like that.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, we're having those conversations with our state agency steering committee, which we're also meeting here shortly next week.
Next week.
And so, yeah, we can.
Jose, can I ask you to take that as an action item just to sort that out with, is that okay?
John Faust is the direct contact.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, that'd be great because that'll come back to Tom, but Jose's mentally on track with that, so thank you. Okay.
One reason why that's so useful is because one of the criterion for identifying preliminary indicators is, data available currently is an important consideration. For the time being, for the implementation of 2018, we do want to think outside the box, if you will, the existing box. At the same time, we want to be able to start launching this and meaningfully applying it. So where there's activities that exist, where data exists, that's really critical for us to be aware of.
So can I ask this, just on this chart, is this intended to be the actionable recommendation component? Because this strikes me as a level of abstraction above the clear, this is what you do to achieve the goal.
No.
That's
the action.
Yeah. This is just what do you measure to see how you're doing.
Right.
And this is still under edit, pretty much.
Yeah.
Week to week.
These were the 44 indicators we took to the plenary session that we had in the afternoon on there. We're trying to actually bring them down to a smaller set. But the other part of this, that is in flux, is that we're doing these pilots at a regional scale as well. We're providing these to the regional pilots as well and saying, can you roll up? So we need a statewide roll up in the water plan. This is the challenge, but we need a regional scale look to roll that up. So, what indicators work best at a statewide scale, what work best in the region, there'll be a little bit of odds, and we're going to have to work through that.
So for the community, this chart, though, is important. There's sort of a managerial sort of saying that you get what you measure. So this is about what you're going to measure. And once we start putting that stuff out there and saying that, we're going to look at that, we're going to report on that, we're going to talk about it. So what you measure can drive a lot of stuff. And this is the place to be strategic, right here.
And there's going to be differences, again, different regions are going to have, so if it's fishery health, anadromous fish are going to be important in one area, some other kind of fish maybe in the south, and I'm not familiar with the fish down there, but suckers, yeah.
Suckers. So there is often people doing these indicators often run afoul the idea that you need to make sure that you measure the things that are most important, as opposed to deciding of the things you measure, how do they tell you what's important, right? So the example I keep using is that when you go to the doctor's office, whether you have an earache or a sprained ankle, when you walk in the door, they take your temperature, your blood pressure, they weigh you, they take your pulse, right? And then they get on to whatever it is that's wrong. But they use those four things to judge whether they need to go deep in any particular spot. So the point I would say here is that if our region, if you think fishery health is important at the state scale, you got to say that. And then we have to say, I think the way we're going to judge whether we're doing well on fishery health is the extent of sucker habitat in the watershed. Now, right, whether that particular measurement is scientifically valid in assessing fishery health across the whole watershed is something that we can argue about, but we shouldn't, right? We should say that this is the thing we're going to use to judge our progress, right? And then we look for trends the same way the doctor says, oh, look, your temperature is 104. I know you came in with a sprained ankle, but we're going to have to figure out what's going on here, right? Anyway, so there's a lot of work that can go, you can really run yourself down to death if you start trying to make sure that the thing you measure is a scientifically valid assertion of a very complex thing. It's better to have the assessment be one of your values rather than of pure science.
This is the part, again, where for the communities, paying attention to this could be really important. This is such a strategic space. Also, so you are aware, you shared that idea at the advisory committee meeting, and the staff now refers to that as the Mike Antos triage theory. It actually has been, we've named it, and it is evoked. It's evoked in meetings.
Oh,
So we
go back and read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, the chapter on assessing heart attacks.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly
Yeah,
the
there's
same
some,
point.
yes. But we've named it. It has a name and staff, and that is referred to that way in staff meetings.
That's wonderful. Look at that.
You're listening. Yeah. Okay, let's keep
Indicators
going.
are important,
Yeah.
and that's chapter 2, structurally for the document.
Okay.
If that's all on chapter 2, I was going to jump into some paraphrased recommendations. And again, I don't know how much time we want to spend on this because this all was in the plenary draft, and
Let's cover it generically, and then once people see the bullet points, that will help them focus their review.
Okay.
And then we can spend the rest of the time on floor, which is where the money is.
Yeah.
That's where we need to hear from Horacio, Karen, and Tanya.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Tanya has a question. She says, where will all these great resources be posted? Sorry.
Okay, so go ahead and tell her where they are.
I know they're not posted anywhere.
Well, they will be,
Yeah,
right.
they will. After the meeting, we'll post them on our meeting materials webpage, and we'll send you a link when they're up.
Right. And because you registered, we'll be able to connect with you. And if you are online with us right now and you've not RSVP'd, this is really important. This is how we know how to find you. So unless you don't choose to be found, which is okay, also you're not required to publicly disclose who you are. However, if you do want us to follow up with you, having you register for this meeting with the SurveyMonkey RSVP would be really helpful. So we know what your emails are and we can keep in touch. Okay.
Okay. So again, just a quick walkthrough of 6 or 8 excerpt recommendations. Codify societal values in legislation. I will say one of the additions that we're adding is recognizing that this is not it's an and both, top down. State can. We've obviously framed this up at the same time in our interaction going forward with regions. We would be inviting the regions to identify the societal values and the indicators. We just had that discussion. So we're tweaking the messaging a little bit on this one in the recommendations, so it doesn't sound like quite so much as a top down. Streamline financial assistance for local and regional agencies vis-a-vis also disadvantaged communities and tribes. So, and that's also in there. And I think you probably saw that, Colin.
Yeah, and if you could just change that language to tribal governments,
Okay.
that would be inclusive of all forms of tribal government.
Okay. Good catch.
Thank you.
And then we're talking about developing a framework for how I talked about this earlier. Watershed scale, how we broach it is important for this water plan, and who's in the room when we talk about it. We're suggesting a broad outreach involving all scales of government and tribal governments as well. Work on the framework for how we successfully go about planning at a watershed scale.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
All right, Lynn has a question about watershed sustainability planning and what that means as different from IRWM plans.
So Lynn, do you want to hop in on the phone, or do you just want to go with your, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I've been meaning to ask this question. I just thought I would ask it now as long as we're on that subject. I didn't see a definition of that or sort of a clear explanation of what that is in the document. So I was just wondering if you could provide that now.
I just laugh because because Paul and I had this discussion yesterday. I go, you haven't defined this. Thank you, Lynn, for saying that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I would agree, and the next chapter 3 will have a more clear definition. Some of it is operational in that it's integrated into some of the recommendations. It frames it up in terms of planning at a watershed scale and collaborating with entities within the watersheds. But I'll just acknowledge that we're working on a more specific definition.
I saw
Okay.
a map yesterday, something that you sent around. The flood group did a report, right? That came around, was it
Flood
yesterday?
investment strategy, I
Okay.
don't know if I sent it, I'm not sure.
It came around yesterday from somebody, and in it is a very interesting watershed scale map of the state.
River Basin?
Yeah.
Referred to?
Yeah,
That was part of the flood investment strategy work that we're balancing kind of the work that they had done in the broader context of integrated water management at a statewide scale. So I don't think we intend to lead off with a delineation of river basins as part of a definitive proposal. In fact, I'm suggesting we work more from the bottom up. Let's engage folks and figure out what makes the most sense from a locality and a regionality perspective.
I entirely honor your trepidation in this space. However, right, balkanization is the status quo that should be resisted by state processes to some extent, right? So it shouldn't be purely ground up, because there will be places that choose to throw up some walls and stay on their own, and that will have long-term problems. Fragmentation is what Colin's pointing to here next to me.
Yeah.
I think it's a convergence of discussions as well. I mean, there's geographical delineations and those discussions, and then there's the work that needs to be done. When we refine our messaging about what intended outcomes are important for the state government, from the state government's perspective, and at what scale, that can help us then define what types of governance and at what scale are best enabled or would be enabled to accomplish those outcomes. So it's kind of again a convergence of the work that needs to be done, and what geographical scales make the most sense from a governance or so on perspective.
And this speaks to those earlier bullets where we were looking at terrestrial and aquifer and all that. So what sort of determining what the scaling is and making it relevant to the management space. So that's a little bit of the struggle, and I know you Mike have been thinking about this. And so just as an aside, Mike and I work with a different group that's doing national IRWM. So it's actually an area I know you've done a lot of thinking on. I don't know if you want to just add to that at all, because that's a lot of what you've been trying to hit at, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two threads of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, is making sure that we are setting the conditions for success for integrated management, and that involves talking to people external and superior to DWR, and making sure that you have the authorities and permissions and all that, right? That's one way to be thinking about it. But the geographer in me really sees a confluence of physical scale, which is what we were talking about a little while ago, and governance scale. And we're really talking about sort of network governance mechanisms. The question is, like, which is the decision-making body that sits at the network coordination role of all the other scales, right? So you may have groundwater management scale at the basin, you have tribal government scale at their either historic or approved scales, right, or reserved scales, right? Like, so you have lots of different spatial scales, but then the integrated work at a basin, river basin, might be the right network hub of all the other scales. And I think that's, I mean, I've been hearing people senior to you in DWR hedging that direction, perhaps over the long term. And I know as both a scholar of this stuff, but then also a member of an agency that helps manage at a watershed scale, I would say that that is a smart direction to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, one of the next steps, and Lisa and I talked about this yesterday as well, is I think we need a focused discussion on framing up this sustainability and then what it means materially in the recommendations for the water plan. And so that's going to require a broader group than certainly internally with DWR. I'd like to involve you all and roundtable of regions.
Yeah.
So, and then when I say bottom up, I mean the conversations need to involve folks that are on the ground that need to do stuff rather than the state coming down saying, for us, it would be most convenient to delineate this river basin. When in reality, all the work is getting done at a local regional scale. That needs to be enabled and empowered ultimately.
So for, just to put your cap in, so we weren't certain, and those who don't know my role, I am content neutral, but I am not process neutral. So I'm always very clear about that. My job as the facilitator is to facilitate the work getting done. So I'm not neutral about that, but I am neutral about the content that belongs to the people in the room, not to me. So one of the things that we talked about was that this is not formed yet. It's not where it needs to be in terms of form. It's good enough. It'll be good enough to get out and start talking about. But like Paul said, the idea that maybe we just really do a deep dive in the same thing, almost like we're doing today, which is wonderful, by the way, of rolling up our sleeves and just thinking through and trying to pound out what some of the stuff looks like. And that might be similar to what we did with ARWM, where we sit down for a day or 2 days and just crawl through it and try to articulate. So some of the stuff for me today that was really exciting was sort of taking a little bit of what Anacita was talking about and translating that into that sort of physical governance space that you were talking about. There's something there that's really important, and it's not quite cooked yet. So whatever that is, I don't know the answer, but I know we have room to work on it. So it's kind of exciting.
And, frankly, part of it is the reconciliation. There's a lot of different visions out there, a lot of emerging approaches. And, so we need to zero in on that for this draft, for the next draft.
Yeah. So, Lynn, we'll put you on the hook for that, just so you know, because I see that as a real work meeting, not normal, talking things.
Briefing.
Yeah.
Is there somewhere written down? What DWR imagines is possible if we get this right? Right? If we all give what we know how to give and the plan gets written the right way, what then happens next? Do we get new policies? I mean, I know you say we achieve these outcomes, but I'm curious, who draws from this the next step to take?
Do you mean with watersheds in particular, or the entire plan?
Like the whole plan.
Well, the implementation plan will lay a lot of that out in terms of if that's what you're asking, how do we move on these recommendations?
I guess, if the plan is by DWR, is it also for DWR?
It's intended to be broader, and our state agency steering committee is the vehicle for accomplishing that in part. So it is intended to be broader.
The water plan is the water plan of the executive branch. And it's delivered to the legislature, and the legislature is responsible for funding or moving forward any particular activities that would require funding or enactment or those kinds of things. So
thank you. That's the answer I was fishing for, not knowing how to ask the question properly. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. So some of the other paraphrased recommendations, lead agency definition, potentially recognizing tribal governments. That one's obviously another existing recommendation. How do we build in the tribal ecological knowledge in a more sustained and...
Can we change recognize tribal governments? Because what's the purpose of lead agency? Is that lead agency for purposes of collaboration or collaboration of joining funding?
It's a governing under under code. Yes, it would have to be a government.
But there's various, even if you're non-federally recognized, you could have a tribal government status as a tribal nonprofit. So it would not necessarily the term recognition would be cause for concern, because you can be a non-fully recognized tribe and take a lead agency status as a tribal government organization through a nonprofit. And so this is what our intent is from that.
We should look at the trouble with paraphrasing is, of course, we lose the detail, but this is very specific to CEQA, Title 14, California Code Regulation 15. So,
but even in CEQA, we're doing CEQA 106 with non-federally recognized tribes who are there as a non-federally recognized tribe with the tribal government status, as a TGO versus NGO. Okay. So I think maybe legal to look at that, and definitely a big flag on that, just to make sure we're not.
AB 52 refers to the heritage trust.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, and AB 52 changes CEQA in general on lead agencies, so.
Okay, great. So do you have that as an action item then? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So the first one is, I'll just let you read through it. So, tribes to be able to have more access to state grants and loans.
And the term reconcile there, sorry to be so, but, no, I'm not sorry, but I've learned not to say sorry so much. But reconcile, I know what our intent is. Is that the most appropriate word here? Because it's not necessarily tribes saying, please let me be part of this. It's like, the process is to be inclusive or to rectify something that has not occurred before. That we are, well, actually, it's in and this is only one coffee on me at 11 o'clock, is that state Prop 1 water bond is allowing for the tribal collaboration at the table. So our process is not to I mean, I know we were talking about being reactive to it. I'd rather have more of a proactive, that our process is to be, so that's what I'm trying to find. I'm trying to find that space.
Okay.
Is that something that requires legal construction, or is that something you feel like you could just offer some draft language?
Yeah, actually, I know these recommendations, we did receive one or two comments from tribes, so I'm guessing this is just a reflection of that. So maybe it would.
Hey guys, this is Sherry on the phone. I'm in this building walking around and nobody can seem to get me to you. How do I find you?
Okay, tell us where you're at and I'll go find you. Are you
sorry? I'm listening to you guys talking about the tribal stuff. I'm on floor 4. They sent me up here. I'm floor 11A and being walked through both areas.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go to the 11th floor in the elevator and I'll be at the door. At the 11th floor.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Actually, if you're on the 4th floor, you won't get to the 11th floor.
She'll have to go.
No idea. They tell me I'm in the wrong building.
Go to the lobby and I'll meet you in the lobby.
She's over in Bonders.
And we'll bookmark this.
Is she in Bonders?
Oh.
She might be in the wrong building.
Sherry, are you in the Bonderson building?
Yeah, I'm in 901. That's what so I guess I'm in the wrong building.
You're going to walk to the main building?
You may not know where that. So we're in the tall building that's kitty corner from 9 and 0. The resources. It's on the agenda.
Tall turquoise building.
Somebody read it.
The track.
Yeah, I know. I know. I just checked it earlier, but I was driving and I couldn't read it. Okay, never mind. I'll keep going. I'll catch up later.
Where Anacita's office is.
Yeah, we're over by Anacita's office, the agency auditorium.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
I'll have to review this afterwards because I can't really walk in here, and now all the stuff I've been waiting for is what we're talking about. So I'll get it later.
Okay, Emily's going to meet you downstairs by the auditorium.
Yeah, we can continue on with the conversation because I know Sherry was one of the.
We
provided quite a bit.
Yeah, I think if we can they just need language. That's all. So just give them whatever the language is, and Emily will come get you right now, Sherry.
Thanks,
you're downstairs auditorium. All right.
Okay. So
now this last one, do you remember?
I don't remember the source.
This
one, chapter 3.
This one is not quite right either.
The liaison word is a little.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, we need some help with this one. The idea was that it came from, and I can't remember the source document. But what they found was that there needs to be some capacity and connection that needs to be financially supported but this is not where it needs to be. So when you guys get into that one, just kind of flag it, and maybe we can come up with some other ideas for what the language should be. But it always shows up that, like, when we do needs assessments, if the community's not adequately represented and they need assistance with that liaison space. So some of it, like we've seen, for example, with self-help enterprises and some other things. Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, that's something where if the community could help us with that, that would be great, with getting better language.
Yeah, so that's out of the convening.
Oh, okay.
Workshop.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it's the shortened version.
I couldn't remember what document came from. Okay.
Yeah. The idea of liaisons was part of what got thought about there.
Yeah, and I've also heard it from Sigma as well, so I couldn't quite remember. And then, yeah, it's and then there are some things going on, like with self-help enterprises and some of the others that are kind of doing some.
Yeah, through state board, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Some.
Okay. I now know what that is.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike, for finding that.
Yeah.
So the liaison isn't the state agency.
I have to tell you, this is the most inconvenient place to park. I have been
Right. Okay. So that's not clear then. Let's clean that up, and then maybe we add that other piece though too, because they're on the community space for your participation. So some way of activity there and like, for example, the DSA, that wouldn't be DWR's role to do that, because those are local.
Somebody, Sherry, meet yourself. It could very well be someone within process who, like Anacita does very well, can help liaise to the local process.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let's look at the language. It's just, it wasn't really clear.
So is this for folks at the state level to be doing this, or more at
this is like Gita Kapai at the State Water Board, Anacita here at DWR, Veronica over at the Energy Sources Board.
That should be a specific state then.
And what that does, that provides for one to anchor the role that agencies and can lead internal reform efforts and make sure the communication is flowing properly. Yeah. It also is someone who anchors direct relationships with the most important constituency.
And the rest of that bullet, the technical is really has been captured, I think, by the state board effort through Prop 1 really well. Mm-hmm. The facilitation piece and some of this liaison concept was also driven by a recommendation that came out of the LA pilot and then also shows up in the visioning workshop, which is the watershed coordination program, watershed coordinators that came out of CalFed, went to Department of Conservation, and then got frozen out of Prop 1, that having those people who are funded by the state to work in that facilitative networking role in the regions was very powerful, especially in the LA region. They were essentially a disadvantaged community coordinator as much as they were a watershed coordinator. Mm-hmm. And reconstituting that program in this effort was a recommendation that showed up a couple of times. And I think it's hiding there inside that facilitation word on this slide, but that idea is still hanging around.
I think those are two really distinct ideas. So I'm going to push on you guys as a process person to separate them, because it's not clear and it gets lost. And I think that's distinct.
Yeah, where are these bullets in the report?
They're in chapter 3. And they're,
Yeah, so go back, look at that. I think this whole section, those community definitely wants to look at.
Even just saying state government. Right. State agency.
Right, and again, I've also been picking stuff up out of Sigma, and it's a default of being in too many meetings because I can't always remember, but I know that's an issue at large. And then, so we've got the state board piece, this piece, and then there's sort of this other component, because that's the actor there is not DWR. That's sort of a philosophical piece around governance, just in general, about representation. So, okay, let's keep going.
Thinking about process, then, if we deep dive on these, we really need the kind of the text in front of us. And what would be the best way to go about crafting these more specifically? I mean, we can send myself variations of this and use?
Yeah, I mean, I
or
would
do we
just
wanna-
ask if you guys could provide suggested text, that would be
Up the chapter.
really helpful, and
That'd be
I
great.
I wanted to flag that though, because it's not something I thought was quite right yet, so, okay.
All right.
What is our timeline, Paul, for
We, well,
things, water plan?
the biggest milestone, pending milestone is February, the end of February, having the public review draft on the street.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that we have to have everything perfected, obviously, and in fact, time being what it is, realistically, we're gonna have to hold, I'm hoping chapter-specific workshops, possibly even after February, just because of the reality of the time crunch. And chapter 3 is huge. I think we really need to roll up our sleeves on this more specifically. I mean, we're getting tidbits and that's useful and we can improve it incrementally, but before we get to the final, I really want us to kind of huddle around this in a more meaningful way and literally bang out these recommendations the way we think we need to be.
And then for you and Lisa and Lou, is there a place in that February release and after time frame to carve out some process for some of the caucus work?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we were talking about that watershed thing, we were talking about maybe immediately after February, sitting down and having that working meeting, because we can always go back and define, like some of that working idea around the watersheds, and that maybe isn't in the water plan itself, maybe it's a white paper, or, you know, and then we tag it out as the document. So there's definitely room around that, the same with the caucus, there's room for those white papers and some other stuff.
Have Sherry introduce herself.
Hey, hi, how are you? I'm okay. Sorry, you guys, I'm a single mom and my school allows me to drop off my child at 9.
Yeah.
I'm in El Cerrito, so this is the fastest I could get there. I had a babysitter and they pulled out and this is it.
We appreciate you being here.
No problem.
Thank
So,
you.
I missed a lot, so I guess I'll just wait and I'll see where we're on the agenda and then I'll just see if we're at the end, so
Yeah.
I'll have to catch up later. But at least we can have lunch, so.
We have a
plan.
meeting, we can catch up and.
Right.
We're just glad you're here. Do you need to just take a deep breath?
Nope, I'm
You
all right.
Okay.
You did it.
Yeah,
You did it. I'm good.
Gotcha. Oh, so we're
Keep going.
We're doing a walk through the document. We
Okay.
just kind of wrapped up the chapter 3. We've identified some areas of the chapter 3 that we think we'd like the group to pay attention to focus on a little bit. We think there's some room there to improve it. And then Paul's asking if people could get suggested text back. Then we also talked about the water plan itself. It's very short, and there's some nuance to some of these ideas and some things that could really use some deeper discussion. That is something we could even do post the public release in February and sit down and take time to write some of those papers and do some of that deeper work that will help clarify, to sort of almost like legislative intent or something like this is what we meant when we talked about this.
Okay.
So people have something to go back to and look at, and it's hard to remember, right? Thank goodness Mike has a good memory. It's like, no, here it is, right here in this document. So that's part of what I think the options are for the next time around. And again, we're happy you're here. So now we're going to jump in to the chapter 4. Are you ready
Hey,
for
Lisa,
that?
on this
Yeah.
one, can I just say one more thing?
Please.
So, on the liaisons, I know you guys are gonna go back and work on it. I just thinking there's a better word, advisor, something like that. So this is a committee advisor or something. Anyway, well, you guys go back. And
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about tribes or whether you're talking about communities, because aren't there tribal liaisons? And is that what they're referring to or not? So I'm not sure.
This is referring to institutionalizing state agency disadvantaged community individuals.
Okay, so then the,
Roles like myself or Geeta that
okay.
you don't have. And
Okay.
so, in fact, we're getting it very little in agencies, in the Department of Toxic and Substance Control, to create a liaison space. But are they tribal liaisons, but are they DAC and EJ? And why do you have DAC and EJ having that one person doing all of it? And it's very expansive. So creating a space for state agencies to understand you do need an agency representative to help facilitate.
So if you choose not to use the word liaison, you might want to have a footnote that talks about the tribal liaison piece, so not to create confusion.
Yeah, or is it a liaison, or is it a policy advisor?
I think at the time we were actually talking specifically about borrowing the tribal liaison like structure and applying it. That was what was being talked about at the event.
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of nuance that probably won't make its way into here, because we also want people with staff, not an overburdened plate,
Right.
a budget,
Right.
and some power in the agency, because
Right.
city and tribal liaisons tend to be systematically deprived of any formal authority. So, go figure.
Yeah, it is hard to imagine. Okay, so keep going, Paul.
All right, so, well, just to wrap it up, on the recommendations, this is still in there. It was in the plenary draft. And so we need to refine this as well. And there is some carryover to chapter 4 on this in terms of quantifying what we mean by, so that's where the rubber meets the road also, obviously.
I just want to appreciate the fact that that second clause for participation of underrepresented groups remains in this recommendation, because as one of the early champions of the idea of baseline funding, it went through the Roundtable of Regions process, and that was very much anchored in Elizabeth Betancourt's early drafts. And then some of the bigger water agencies got their hands on it, and that piece seems to have kind of been bled out. So I would love to see that stay in there. And just my statement in that regard is a little bit of a heads up in case you get some blowback. Please hold firm.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right.
Next one. Next one.
So,
Now, and this, I might hop on this a little pressure, background, but go ahead and start, and I just want to warn you, I might jump in.
oh, fine. Yeah, that's, so chapter 4, there was a version of chapter 4 as part of the plenary draft. There was a big, I think I put in about a 4-sentence disclaimer. This is just an information dump, and we needed to synthesize it. And it was my personal mission to take kind of a lot of the work that had been done to date and put into the prior drafts and really string it into a succinct, meaningful story and sharpen the messaging. And so that's what this version represents, is my first attempt to streamline. I kind of took the chapter on personally, and so I'll take the blame or credit if that were to occur. Actually, I want to give credit to the team if that's the case.
You do also have a disclaimer on this.
Yeah. The disclaimers galore, especially with chapter 4. Whenever there's numbers involved, obviously, it's...
This is part of his going rogue. I think did you just decide to do that for November?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I had an epiphany or whatever, emboldened. So, because chapter 4 was all over the place, I admit, and it was had a lot of information that wasn't really cohesive. And my approach here at this point is to just take this chapter. I stripped it down. In fact, I started with a blank sheet of paper, and I like the way our editor phrases it when we talk about does this belong in here. The way he characterized it is content has to earn its place in this document. So I stripped it down. If we're going to add stuff and we think there's important parts of the story, great. But it has, a lot of the content is not in here that was in the prior draft. That said, we're going to create reference and technical guides. We're going to sustain them from prior water plans, whatever we end up calling them. But the backup information will be available. So I took out a lot of details, and I would say even what I might call information I've taken out of here. This is synthesis. It's intended to be right to the point of what this chapter needs to do, which is a good segue to preface on this. Is we want this chapter to illustrate the funding needs, describe where they came from, and contextualize the funding needs, as we call them, in this chapter, and assess the funding mechanisms that are available, identify and assess the mechanisms, new and existing, and then stitch them together into composite funding packages. We call them scenarios at this point, that are viable, plausible, and have acceptable trade-offs for paying for the recommendations in 2018. So it makes the case for the funding recommendations of 2018, excuse me. So that's the job of this chapter. I probably should have put it in writing, because that helps us kind of get our minds around it. But that's what I'm hoping you can provide feedback on. Does this chapter do its job? And if not, how can we improve it to do so? So enough background on this chapter and caveats. And
I would just reference my earlier comments about history and inequitable history with respect to water resource investments. and I think it's worthy of note, even if in brief.
And maybe I'll use that point to jump in. So one of the things that was done on the technical side was they did an inventory of spending, and they tried to understand where money was being spent and use it in identifying what potential funding sources might be, because there are certain types of spending that are more suitable to certain fund sources. One of the things that was identified and came directly out of some of the bigger conversations at the plenary was the historic underrepresentation in any historic package of a variety of communities, as well as ecosystem investment, and that by working to or using models that actually stand on historic practices, that you were inherently disadvantaging the larger conversation. So one of the things that the staff was able to do is work with the consultants to require that the model itself be recalibrated to add in and compensate for the lack of previous understanding that needed to be represented in the model itself. So one of the reasons that, and this has been a struggle, I speak as a third party observing the staff, is that a pure disconnect, the kind of the traditional even modeling practices and the way that we traditionally look at the portfolios of investment. So I just want to give some real props to Lou and Paul for just kind of standing firm on that and consistently raising that flag. So as a result, that's one of the reasons we've ended up with this more of a scenario outline rather than just using raw model outputs and saying, here's some different packages of looking at it, and here's how that kind of turns out. So an important piece of what the community can do as you're giving feedback would be really look at those trade-off analysis. Here's the pros and cons of going this direction. Here's the limitations of this sort of an approach to this scenario, so that when people are trying to make decisions and weigh certain directions to go, that's a piece of the conversation. That will not come from the technical work. That will require the sensibility of the communities to pay attention to it. So that's kind of my preamble to this, and then I'll let Paul kind of talk about what's in here.
Oh, that's good. And I specifically what Lisa's talking about is when you quantitatively or otherwise constrain future funding opportunities to existing mechanisms, there's biases, I guess you might call it, built into it.
Yeah.
And so what we tried to do is work past that. Some of it came down to just insisting that we hard code a funding stream for DAC purposes. And so it's a workaround, but on the output side and in Chapter 5, that'll be reflected. So the fact that we're not funding to historical, I don't know, biases is kind of a charged word, constraints of existing mechanisms. And we carry that conversation.
But Colin can say it.
Yeah. I'll call them historical.
Did you realize that for hundreds of years, including up until the 1980s, race was taken into account to formally offer or not federally subsidized loans?
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
do you want a primer on the history of bias and just how recent it is?
So I think that's really it was the fatal flaw of all the modeling, right? It's so kind of trying to backcast into that. So I'm just offering again to the community, please pay attention when you look at the trade-off analysis and that kind of thing, that conversation is present when you look at that.
Right. And
over in IRWM, I was just with the other group that does the acronym the other way around. Over in that program, we've made some headway, and I think what we're going to learn relatively soon is that the program is prepared to allow the competitiveness that's written into the statute to be handled regionally, and the DWR will concede that regional group that handles a competitive process for allocation, that competitiveness can be situated at the regional decision makers. And to me, that is a step in the right direction here, because competitiveness often results in giving the money to the people who have the money to compete, right? So having the regions be able to exert their own understanding of what competitiveness should be in their region, I think would be really powerful in connection with this. Go ahead.
You mean by building the criteria by which?
Are you doing okay? Do you need a break? No, you're all right. Okay. Okay. Poor note taker can't.
And maybe you're going to address this later in the description. But do I assume correctly that some of the funding and investment analysis specifically looks at the way in which local jurisdictions which provide the most funding are leveraging off of state investments?
There's
Some of
yes. Yes.
There's been something that I've noticed in working in a couple different IRWIMPs at the same time is that you may have one IRWIMP region that's downriver from another, and they may have some more funding than the ones upriver. And the way that IRWIMPs are created, they're not watershed wide, so it's impossible for those funds to be supporting those upriver projects, wherein it might benefit the downriver folks to be able to do something upriver with those funds. And it's something that we used to have this interregional conversation that we used to have. We had the interregional pot of money, and to have those conversations, and that pot of money disappeared, and also the ability to do those kinds of cross-regional, I don't know, it's something to explore because I'm seeing it multiple times.
That would be something to look at when you guys go back and look at the recommendations, to pay attention to that as well. So this gets into that liaison business, and that one, although that certainly feeds that, but that collaboration space, and if you look at the worksheet, that just kept coming up over and over again, the fact that you need to rethink that.
Yeah, that's part and parcel with the watershed planning that we just talked about.
Yeah, it's kind of like a
Funding
TMDL. You know, you look at the TMDL, and then maybe you can't do something about it right there, but you could do something up here.
Right.
But if the funding doesn't transfer, or
Right.
Right. Right. Well, this is definitely, so go ahead and keep going, Paul, because I think the group will be interested in this.
Okay, so just a kind of a high-level walkthrough of this chapter and what it's all about. First of all, acknowledging that we need to align our investments better, and this gets into, again, the historical constraints of existing funding mechanisms. We need to better align our investments with our values as framed up in the water plan in this case. And in that sense, Californians do place a high value on statewide sustainability. At the same time, a lot of the activities that support it lack the stable and sufficient funding. And this is more pertaining to, and by the way, part of the streamlining and sharpening of this is to focus on state government's role, so as to not kind of walk over the top of the regional and local entities. So setting up that discussion, creating a pretty specific statement that annual historical funding isn't going to cut it going forward. We can't pay for the recommendations in Chapter 3 with the funding that has occurred thus far. And again, there's two dimensions. There's adequacy and stability, and those are two slightly different things. And we're suggesting they're both in play in terms of being inadequate for funding the recommendations in Chapter 3. So additional funding is needed to accomplish things like improving California's watershed, and again, sharpening it to what the state's roles and responsibilities are. The scope and setting, this just describes that at different funding streams create different levels of adequacy and stability. Generally, some of the ratepayer stuff tends to be more stably funded. A lot of good things are happening at a local level because of that. They're enabled to do that, to have more stable investment in things like water, wastewater treatment, and so on. On the other hand, so just to set off kind of what the state's role is and some of its trials and tribulations, things like flood management tended to be a little more difficult in terms of stable funding, planning and data. Obviously, a lot of this, I think a lot of this is no-brainer. I won't go into too much detail, but we do specify disadvantaged communities and ecosystem as being a big part of that.
I really bristle at disadvantaged community being in that list, because it's not, disadvantaged community as a thing is the challenge, right? That, like, the communities are disadvantaged along multiple axes that are water and not water related. I understand how it ends up in that list. It feels wrong to me because the challenges that they face are the same as the other things in the list. They have these challenges, and they have challenges that are not on this list that are unique to each community, right? And I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about this.
If you want to provide some.
I can maybe, I was thinking of something that might add in, I don't know what to do with the sentence, but one of the feedback that I'm getting from tribes right now has to do with the funding flows having to do with sustainability. You can go in and you can put in a new water system. You can train their tech, but they may never have, the disadvantaged community may never have the funding to pay anyone to run it.
Right.
And so then they rely on the RCACs and the other groups that come in. And really what's needed for capacity building is for those communities to have their own experts that live there, that will stay there, that don't travel and disappear. So I don't know how to work it in there, but I'm really thinking that a sustainability or something, whether that be workshops so they know where to find funds, I'm not sure, but something needs to happen because
that maybe we need to rephrase it. That was the intent of actually these last two sentences, that sometimes we can build stuff, but we can't afford, or folks can't afford to maintain and operate it in the long term.
Yeah.
And deferred maintenance.
So much of the stuff that I've learned over the years and the things I advocate for through my work is to problematize the unitary disadvantaged community frame that all of us use. Like, we talk about it like it is a thing, and that by calling it that, we understand what to do and what it needs.
not enough detail.
Right. And the problem is that, like, the frame itself is problematic. I had a high school student at a meeting one time. At the end, I said, "Hey, what do you think about this meeting?" She's like, "I don't know." And I was like, "Well, what did you think?" She said, "Disadvantaged is mean," right? Like, so she was talking about the word itself.
Yeah.
Right. And anyway, so I think maybe another sentence where disadvantaged community comes out and gets a more nuanced description.
Okay.
I think might be very
And
valuable.
I feel the same way in terms of it not
got it.
belonging in that.
I don't have one.
Yes. I get that same taste.
Yeah. Disadvantaged how?
Yeah.
We have rich culture.
And just to kind of recalibrate on what this is intended to do, it's intended to kind of show a compare and contrast of, at a local level, things in some sectors are fairly well funded. Things the state government's responsible for have not so much, and that's because they're funded, in part, it's because general fund is kind of unpredictable and unstable. General obligation bonds are unpredictable and unforeseeable, and catch as catch can. And, things like geo bonds tend to not be well suited for funding ongoing activities like maintenance. That's what this paragraph's intended to accomplish. So with that in mind, if you want to provide some better language.
Yeah, like on the other hand, taking out disadvantage out of the parentheses and say, on the other hand, disadvantaged communities or supports too, including the other stuff.
Okay.
Because, but I do see that.
Will there be an opportunity for me to have access to this Word file and then give you some track changes?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. And I know brevity is an important part.
Yeah. And also, when you see the word disadvantaged communities in the North Coast, we're calling it DAC, so we're saying disadvantaged and tribal communities. I don't know how we want to work it, but you don't like that either, huh?
No, do it.
Yeah.
Why not?
DTI.
Why not?
DAC?
He doesn't like
So DAC.
Oh, DAC.
He goes with
Okay.
DTI.
I try to get rid of DAC wherever I can.
Yeah, we can still get rid of DAC, but whatever that term is going to be, and tribes.
One thing that we've talked about, that we've always been very, very careful to not conflate the two things, that they're very distinct. So there's some places where combining makes sense and some places where they don't. So part of it will just be looking at text and that's where the sensibility community, that's not our call, that's your call.
Rule of thumb, when this is all over, I would go through it, and every time you see the word government or state or agency, consider that tribe probably should be there. And then when there's also the word disadvantaged community, it's also true that tribal community need to be there too. So there's kind of a dual place for them.
Okay, so
Right.
The editing moment.
Okay, and then this next paragraph, all it does is describe the fact that this is focused on state government roles, responsibilities, obligations, and so on. And that does include local assistance and the activities we just talked about, supporting disadvantaged communities, engagement, and so on. In lieu of, this is kind of important, but it requires a little explanation. In lieu of say, emulating a local capital improvement plan where you have a discrete set of projects, it's easy to cost it out, it's relatively easy to then identify the best ways to pay for stuff and schedule it out for its implementation. That's not practical and not within the charge of the water plan to prioritize projects and plans for that matter. In lieu of that, we're in this chapter recommending an increase, a bump in funding. We call it realistic and measured. We can describe it differently if need be, to pay for implementing Chapter 3. That's where, again, I'm hoping to focus this chapter, and I'm interested in your feedback if that focus is advisable, but that's what this attempt is right now. Is we need an extra chunk of money, we being state government, partnering with locals and local assistance and so on. So it's the big we need a bump in money, a bump in funding to begin implementing Chapter 3. So that's a little less defensible than here are these 10 projects, they need to be implemented over the next 20 years. Here's the very identifiable and applicable funding streams. So it's a little different, necessarily different strategic approach to funding, which I just wanted to make clear is oftentimes, especially at a local or regional scale, kind of funding and planning tend to be more at a project scale, including in flood management at the state scale, tends to be very project supported, project focused. This is not, and necessarily so. It's more strategic. We look at a 50-year planning horizon, but we want to emphasize the next 5 years. So implementation of this water plan update 2018. And again, in maintaining a little bit of parallel and kind of an evergreening, if you will, of the Governor's Water Action Plan, discrete, implementable chunks of recommendations and funding and associated funding. And because it doesn't have to be the catch-all, end-all, because again, we have the luxury, if you will, of updating the plan every 5 years.
I'm sorry, when you say discrete, what did you mean by that? I'm sorry, I just want to understand. Or is it
How did I just use it?
I don't know, discrete, implementable of the Governance Action Plan is what I got, so I just was like trying to figure out what that means. Instead of transparent, usually I would see, I see discrete, and I just want to know.
It's in this paragraph.
Okay.
Is that, no, that was one.
No, you said, it was what you said,
oh.
so I just was wondering.
Oh, just that this is not, the water plan is not based on or nor recommending specific project or plans move forward.
Thank you.
That's maybe what I meant by discrete.
And also, the water code itself precludes that.
Okay.
And that causes some frustration for people.
Okay.
Sometimes when they read the plan. And the reason being what you just asked Mike a little earlier was because it's the legislature's prerogative.
And
okay.
And I was just noting it one could argue it makes it a little more difficult to make the case for what needs to be implemented. We don't have a list of projects we can pull out in our back pocket. Rather, there's categories of projects that are important, and there's the recommendations in Chapter 3. So it's a higher level scale.
Okay.
And do you?
Why higher up, like big picture?
Yeah,
the Google Maps, you can't get into someone's house, but you can. Okay.
If you think of a geobond, you know, the level.
That's a really awesome metaphor. Answers triage. That's going to be Google Maps.
Yeah.
Google's fine.
Yeah. And setting that expectation is important because, as Lisa said, it has frustrated some that come to the table thinking, okay, where's my project? Where's my plan? And it's not the scale we're planning.
Yeah, and
got it.
Paul, do you make reference at least to some of those existing project development pipelines? So, you know, like IWM, Sigma's one, you know, like they're places from whence those come.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And the cost, the funding need is derived from a compilation of a bunch of plans, you know, all IRWM plans, capital improvement, and so on. But on the back end, the recommendations are not at that scale.
Yeah. Okay.
Although the way you phrased that, I'm wondering, partly one of the things that the plan does talk about is creating the enabling conditions for moving forward on those kinds of planning scales, and that is being proposed for funding versus the specific projects that may come from the process.
Yeah.
So that's the tack on it.
Right. It harkens back to the 5 priorities of the water plan, which are all enabling governance, funding, so on, regulation.
If it's the case that Karen Nilsson and Horacio are still on, this is one area in which they both excel. It'd be great to have them pipe in if they so choose.
I think they're still here, so and if you don't want to talk, it's fine. You can just chat with Francisco, and he'll read it. or we're happy to open your mics. Looks like they're on their computer mics, so that they may not,
They may be silent.
yeah.
So this next paragraph is an acknowledgement of the work that was done in 2013 and its value and use going forward in 2018. And this is why this draft isn't quite ready for release.
This is one of our transparency things.
When we don't want to stand by it, we take it to light gray.
Pay no attention to that.
This is just stuff we wrote. It doesn't.
Because, you know, the danger is that as we paraphrase what we think we heard in 2013 and codify or, committed to, if it's improperly paraphrased, that can create problems. So we need to make sure we got it right. And so far, this is not it.
There was a lot of work. A lot of folks in the room right now physically weren't involved. There was a ton of work that was done. AUK was very much involved. TNC, some of the other agencies around that funding construction, and we have some buy-off from that community about moving forward with this. So one of the things that Paul has wanted to do is leverage that first piece and then build on that and kind of transition to this next phase of work.
And we heard from some of the veterans of the Finance Caucus from 2013 saying, hey, we put a lot of time and we agreed on this stuff. Let's keep it in play explicitly.
It is my impression that the Finance Caucus, of which I personally was not a part, did not benefit from broad disadvantaged community or tribal participation.
That's correct.
So it'll be interesting to see, and hopefully staff can help mitigate this bias to the degree to which the current recommendations have been calibrated with all the nuance that's required for those communities in their relationship with finance.
Right. I would like to be part of the next time there's a caucus for that.
So next Monday
Yeah.
will be the next meeting here, and it will actually it'll be at Bonderson where she went.
I'll be on the phone.
It'll be in the workshop area in the Bonderson building, and that meeting will be in the morning, the terrible 9 a.m.
Yep.
And because it's government, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But anyway, we'll be there all morning, and we will be focusing. We've spent more time with you guys on the whole document because I think that's really relevant.
Webinar?
Webinar is an option. It's not the best, but yes, absolutely, we'll have webinar. I have about 30 people signed up right now on webinar. So it'll be so right.
At least I have to chase people around with a microphone.
That's okay. We don't mind.
See
if I can. Yeah, that would be. Thank you. So anyway, that will be, I'm sure, a lively discussion. So we're coming in. They haven't seen any of this. It's one of the reasons we wanted to show it to you guys first and have you flag things, right?
Yeah. So yeah, we can make this available. And so the point here, and this, Colin, you might want to look at too, and surmise what, are there any gaps, and can we incorporate them in terms of going forward, what we do about it, those gaps. And they're kind of all over the board. That's why I need to clean this up.
Yeah, and this would be the kind of thing where Paul needs to hear from you on this particular piece. And verbal's okay. You can, I'm sorry to volunteer you, but you can call Paul. You don't, if you think this through, or but email works really good. So here's rethink this paragraph or look at this. That'll be much easier. But if we can get this as tight as possible for Monday, though, that would be great. Because we want to walk in with something. And also now that you know it's here, and if you can't participate Monday, that'd be good also.
Yeah. And I agree. If literally marked up versions of this is obviously the most effective way for us to compare.
We'll get you guys the text, and if you're online and you want the text, I need your email.
Well, it's all of chapter 4. Page 2.
That's where we'd find that grid.
Yeah. I don't know that you'll find that to be the most important part at this time, but you're welcome to comment on that as well. So the next part of the story, so we set up kind of the setting and scope and recognize prior work and how it's being brought into the plan. Next is the funding needed for recommended actions. And this is where I'm proposing that we sharpen this message. And if I want to hear again from you all if it makes more sense. The prior draft had kind of the what I've been calling really, it's highly technical, but the whole enchilada in terms of funding needs for state IWM management, state, local, federal, statewide, kind of rolled up into this big ticket item, kind of a sticker shock value, I guess, is what that may provide. But I think what I'm hoping to do is focus this more on, this is what we need to, in order to implement Update 2018, and focus the water plan and the funding plan on that in particular.
Do you assess how well you've implemented 13? Does that happen somewhere?
Yes and no.
Not explicitly, no. And part of it is because of the volume of information. We could go back and kind of, on a one-to-one basis, an alternative, and part of Chapter 5, we don't have it queued up to talk about today, is an annual implementation progress report, which we hope to do going forward. So that we can answer yes to that question when it's post to 2018.
They did start with 2018. They actually went through the recommendations chapter and reviewed every single recommendation for 2013 and did an assessment of it at kind of where things were and relative to this plan, kind of what kind of should continue to roll forward. And then we did try to, in 2013, do a progress report, which had mixed results. And part of what we found was that the metrics were they weren't adequate or proper for that kind of a review, because a lot of it, and a lot of things were ongoing too. So we're supporting ongoing activity, and you can go, yes, we're doing that. Is that sufficient, or does that get to an outcome that you're saying? So it was really a deficiency of the crafting, and that was okay. At the time, it wasn't written for that. So that, in part, is why you're seeing this particular structure in this document.
Yeah, so going forward, Chapter 5, we want an implementation status report. That's just focused on, did the legislature authorize this action, or was funding made available? Whatever the recommendation is, the more in-depth of was it effective conversation is more in the sustainability outlook realm, which would occur on a 5-year time step. Did the funding, did the funding, did it make a difference? And it's on a 5-year time step only because you really can't detect on an annual time step if your objective of improving fisheries actually worked, or your investment in fishery habitat. So just to kind of tease out those two dimensions of progress reporting. So with the funding needs, this is the whole enchilada, statewide, IWM, every governmental level. So a roll-up of all the plans. It's not a complete estimate, but it's probably the best available, the most complete estimate. It'll still be evolved going forward. But this is where we just kind of show, yeah, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment need at every level of government over the next 50 years.
It would be so cool, and I don't know whether Pacific Institute or PPIC, like how much money do we spend on water every year? Well, like how much water money gets spent every year in California? Because 365 billion looks big. Maybe it's not quite so big compared to
You need a pie chart in there,
Yeah.
you need, right?
Right, like, well, the delta between what we do now and what we need to do might not be so breathtaking.
Yeah, I think what you're getting to is what's the gap in part. And in 2013, we did identify expenditures, historical expenditures, and in 2018, we expanded that through, I think, 2015. And to answer your question, what we've identified statewide IWM is about 20 billion a year, 18 of which is generally at local level. So the state comes in with 1 to 2 billion historically. Feds less than $1 billion annually. Is that kind of what you were?
Yeah, I mean, I think contextualizing, because
In the chapter.
a lot of what we do will keep doing.
Yeah.
Some of what we do we'll stop doing, and a bunch of stuff we don't do we'll start doing.
Yes.
Right. And to me, the biggest picture of that money flow is a useful story to tell.
Yeah. Well, that's the story behind this 200, the gap. There's are you, sorry.
Oh, he has the
We're
graph.
fighting for the,
No.
so there's a gap in there of 200 billion called out in Chapter 4, and that's the difference between the overall need and our existing funding levels. So,
What Mike was, I think, maybe saying was the total is 20 million
yeah,
over that 50 years. That we're already spending on
20
water.
billion a year.
That'd be
Right?
$1 trillion that we're already spending. So that we're just asking for either the 210 gap, I guess.
Yes.
So it's a 20% I don't know, just a different way to state it maybe than, here's 365 billion and everyone goes, well, goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
I'd be a little cautious about making that argument too much, but the reason I say that is every time we go for a budget change proposal, they look at our current budget and they say, why can't you just be more efficient about what you're doing, right? And make that up. And, you know, so you have to kind of balance that argument with the fact that this is really new money in a different area that hasn't been spent.
Yeah, I mean, but we're really good at talking about water supply portfolios, right? Shouldn't we use, I mean, conservation is part of our water supply portfolio, and we talk about conservation as a supply source, right? Which means we should be able to, we should be comfortable making that same case on the money, right?
Yeah.
That some of the things we do now are maladaptive, and we're going to stop doing it. And that money savings can be part of the effort to get the new things.
Yeah. Yep. And yeah, I mean, reducing the soft cost of regulatory compliance or whatever, there's efficiencies to be gained.
So there are some things I want to just do a quick check-in. There's some things I think it's really important you need to see the scenarios. And you've got a little bit more preamble.
I can go through it faster.
Okay, and then on this one, we're going to work on that Monday too, right? If we have time.
With the
the value add,
funding, with the funding.
the driver.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe what we could do, if you guys want to get a jump start on the little state roll thing, you can do that. We'll work on it Monday. I think if we have time at the end, I'll just come back to this, but we do need to also talk about some next steps, and I want to make sure you see the scenario. So this one I'll kind of push to the end. If we don't get to it, it'll be all right. We'll hit it Monday and go from there. Okay.
Okay. So that's the whole enchilada, that's the big picture, and we're seeing some tweaks in how we can characterize it and use it to better contextualize. That's good. And then the crux of the story, in my view, is what do we need to implement the actions in Update 2018
That's not very much money.
and beyond. And so this is additional, just to be clear. So early on, 1 to 2 billion a year is the storyline that we're crafting, can launch. It's not enough to begin fully implementing everything in Chapter 3. And again, that's because it needs to be tempered by kind of the realistic, what's reasonable, given the funding mechanisms, general fund, geo bonds, novel mechanisms. They have their own types of constraints based on willingness and ability to pay. So we're kind of at an and both. What do we think we need versus what do we think we can accomplish realistically?
What has not been there historically.
Right.
Because we don't have a metric to say, and the reason why you have disadvantage or underrepresented is because they were never part of the original metric. Right.
Right.
So I mean, if we're looking at, you know, factoring in based on historical purposes, and when legislators are looking at this, they're really going to be very soft-tuned to just like, well, this is what's in this water plan. Right. And so what I'm looking at is as water planning legislative actions, when we have to do budget change proposals, we don't have the missing metrics that you need for the underrepresented communities. And I don't know if this is the place for it, or, well, it is the place for it, but where would you put that in, and how do you fold that into it?
And I would add to what Aniceto is saying that something that we talked about a long time ago was that how do you know that a metric for how do you know that the community actually received what they wanted and someone didn't just write them in. Same for tribes, so they didn't just write them in. So I don't know if that's a letter of thank you from the community or I'm not sure, or an agreement or
in the assessment or in the assessment of were things actually implemented.
Right, and I remember saying, you know, how hard would it be to spot check, to pick up the phone and call, hey, how'd that go? And have people say, but then I heard, oh no, we can't do that. That would take too long. But if you're spot checking, it's just a couple of phone calls. So, you know, just to check in. I mean, it could be part of the exit report, you know.
I think that needs to be part of the indicators discussion as well in terms of checking back in.
So just to restate, and we try to get at this with historical models also. So just to restate, though, in projecting what the funding is, what historical is, and the fact that the historical is historically underfunded in two sectors in particular. So that's sort of separate and apart from, so when you look at the big number, making sure that that's accommodated for. So that's, I just want to pull that out. That is something that was definitely part of the historic, but not the go forward conversation. Okay, keep going.
All right.
Great.
And this, you've spoken with Max Gomberg over at State Board. Got slightly different numbers, higher numbers.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's take that as an action item. Just go talk
You should talk to Max.
Higher numbers for total need and for,
Okay.
yeah. Well, and by the way, part of the caveat, and I'm sorry, I know we need to keep going. It's important to note that the whole enchilada, and maybe we need a better term, but whether it's 100 billion or 100 trillion, at least for the water plan, doesn't really drive the outcome because we're only going to fund this much of it. So whether it's here or here, yeah. So
5 years.
It's always useful for context. You know, we're funding a fraction. Either way, the message is we're funding a minute fraction of the total need. Right. However, we do want to have a defensible whole enchilada story, and
well, you make different choices about in what you invest if you're looking at a 100-year horizon and a plan to backfill gaps, than if you're,
And that actually speaks to exactly the strategy around this too. It's sort of camel nose intent strategy. So just stepping on the path and starting the ball rolling and creating the enabling conditions to get some of the things done.
And so that's why an example, a case in point, is these numbers. We've arrayed the cost information by water sector. And we did have to hard code some ecosystem in there too, by the way, because sure, there's flood plans, there's water plans. There isn't the same level of ecosystem restoration plans statewide. So we had to make some assumptions that we can leverage some of the PPIC.
Where's the assumptions on, and that little number 3 goes to?
PPIC, I think, had some numbers that we read. I think we looked at like a mid-range of PPICs. What was it, if you recall, Jose? 300 million a year to 700 million a year or something for ecosystem.
Yeah.
I just noticed from the tribal perspective, I look and it's the smallest pot, except for, so I'm like, why is that? Just, I want to check.
That's right.
So I'll take a look to see.
Because it is historically underfunded, and that's in fact part of, when you look at this graph, that's useful to have that conversation. Why does that look that way?
Right.
Yeah, and if that's PPIC's work, that'll be Dr. Jeff Mount's work. You can always call him.
Okay. Thanks.
And then more specific to the water plan, we've arrayed the costs for implementing Chapter 3 by the 5 priorities. So this helps us also show, it really, I think, is insightful in terms of, call it a pittance, but for alignment, that's a very different number than for the infrastructure, which, by the way, I want to be quick to note that that includes green and gray infrastructure, as we call it. So that's by hands down the biggest expense in implementing Chapter 3. So that's another way to array the costs. So how do we pay for this stuff? That's the funding mechanisms. We know we need a mix, all of the above, if you will. Different mechanisms work better for different things. Bonds pay for capital really well. Not so much ongoing annual expenditures. Need a different kind of funding stream. We try to, part of making the case for this, for the funding mix is we really, stability and predictability are really important for return on investment. And we kind of give some examples. So we minimize deferred maintenance if we have stability and predictability. But there's also just the startup and fits and starts of construction and planning processes. There's really a lost opportunity in stranded cost and spotty data and intermittent data. So anyway, not to belabor it, that's important, stability and predictability. Let's see. So we mentioned there's a whole bunch of different types of funding mechanisms. This is the assessment and description of everything in play for funding state government activities to help inform their future use. We talk about this annual variability or reliability, applicability, what works for what types of
And
management
then
action.
this is important in particular for this conversation. So as many of you know, whenever there's a desire for more funds, that kind of default is, well, that's what the general fund is for. And so I'm looking at you, Colin. So part of what this document is trying to do is make the case that that is not the most rational way to think about this. That because of the reliability, because of the stability, we've got to really rethink and really what should be paying for things. So this document has to make this case. So as you're reading, that's the part where we need you to sharpen your pencils and really push us to get this document where it needs to be.
And as for the novel mechanisms, this is where the discussion is broached, where these are the types of things, there's things we can do differently going forward, and they can provide greater reliability in some cases, greater applicability in some cases less. The water surcharge, for example, may have less applicability than a tax in the general fund. So we start framing that up. And this is what we really wanted to share with you today are the funding scenarios and the trade-offs thereof. So Chapter 4 will describe the trade-offs of the scenarios. The scenarios that are found to be plausible, that have acceptable trade-offs, will be moved forward into Chapter 5 as funding recommendations. So really Chapter 5, we kind of backed off from calling it a funding plan per se, because what we'd like to offer instead are 2 or more alternative funding scenarios that the legislature and the administration can look at and say, yeah, based on my constituency, where we're at with willingness to pay, political drivers in play at that time, this seems to be the most implementable. All of them, again, have passed the plausibility test, the giggle test, but we're suggesting this discussion is a little bigger than the water plan, zeroing in on one mix of funding recommendations. This is the only way to go. Can possibly inhibit implementation if it's found to be not feasible based on, again, the political topics du jour and so on.
And we also, in looking at this from the process side, the construction of this, the trade-off analysis for each of these is informing in and of itself. And so our expectation is, as often happens, if we do this, the kind of package that may come out of it will be tailored. So if we can nail that trade-off stuff, that's going to be so useful to, say, a negotiation where a community is trying to work across the street and get some sort of a package going and say, here's how you can kind of play with this a little bit. So we actually don't expect, as staff anyway, that any of these would actually be adopted. It's probably some amalgamation of, of all of them together, or some parts thereof. So like a lot of the stuff you guys have worked on, your NEPA planning documents and things like that are normal for you to work on.
Are you able to express at the recommendation scale which funding source is most appropriate?
Are we going to hear from CH2M again?
Well,
Can we see scenario D a little bit?
Like call out something that happened
Unless we're gonna.
the short answer is yes, because that table that I showed earlier has the applicability description. When on the back end, when we identify a permutation of a composite of mechanisms, the applicability came into play.
Got it, okay.
So yeah.
But just to explain myself, the reference to CH2M is in I think it was the first and only to date, what was that meeting, the finance?
Yeah, we did have a finance.
Yeah. Summer, CH2M gave a presentation under contract from DWR for some of this work and had kind of a tool. It was kind of a
model.
It was a plug in some stuff and it comes out the other end and tells you more or less what singular funding thing. It wasn't kind of like a portfolio approach, but what singular funding might be best suited. Didn't meet, just to reflect on that, didn't meet with a lot of applause from the finance gurus in the audience that day. So I don't know if we're going to hear from them on Monday or not.
They'll be in the room because they're doing a lot of the supporting work, compiling funding needs and so on. And just so you know, what we're
So we have a little sideline conversation. What you're seeing here with the array of scenarios is Kamiara sensibility. And this is an approach the water plan is used beginning in '05. And so he really impressed the importance of having people understanding what trade-offs are and understanding how things look, and that's not a simple singular answer.
Well, just to add some of the nuance from before, not that I expect you, Paul, necessarily to embed this all, when you talk about borrowing, that is also part and parcel of the reciprocal feedback loops that systematically disadvantaged communities and are linked to, racial justice and racial apartheid, because you have, Moody's and other credit rating agencies looking at the financial sustainability of municipalities, which is very tied to the history of infrastructure development and income earning potential, which has its roots in housing bases, all of which had racial components, often formally in law. You have to think, like Ferguson is one of those places where you had over policing, and Moody's took expressly into account in giving it a low credit rating the percentage of the budget made up of fines and court fees, right? So you have communities that are similarly situated in some respects, but are paying consistently more to borrow the same dollars. I think that's a level of nuance that is hard to capture here, but is really important to capture in the back end numbers.
And it isn't. That's the part where the trade-off analysis, and that's the part where you can do the white papers and say, when you're looking at this package, you have to take this into account. That is a piece of your trade-off analysis, and making that visible. And that for me is quite striking in terms of where we can extend the policy space on this. So if that's your message, there isn't a process to address that.
That would be important too, but this is actually for the scenarios on the state.
Right.
Yeah, so the state,
So it doesn't get down to the municipality level. So we avoid it in a sense, but it's not a bad conversation.
Right. I think you could really take that into the extension space, because you can also come up to like SRF funds and the matching space, like that. So that's, as you're looking at a trade-off analysis, because that's kind of partly going to have a different scenario to it with borrowing than it would with, say, a different fund source.
Remind me then to send you the Transform Finance Institute's webinar on that very subject.
Yeah, but I think and getting back to the white papers, say, from the committee or from the caucus, these are some places, this is places you can go, and it's worth talking about.
Yeah.
So just to kind of close out this chapter 4, so there's these scenarios that are emerging. We have a frame of reference. I don't want to refer to it as a baseline because that's presumptive, but it's relative to current trends. How do the trade-offs deviate relative to what we did recently? One looks at the reliance on borrowing. Is it feasible to really go heavy on state general obligation bonds to pay for a major chunk of the costs to implement the water plan? Similarly, or conversely, state general fund, more of the pay-as-you-go type thing, emphasizing that as one of the primary mechanisms is another scenario. And then one is when we start broaching novel mechanisms, if we look at the historical maximum for GO bonds and state general fund, and then we look at that extra chunk of money, filling that gap with novel mechanisms, what does that look like in the funding mix and the trade-offs? And this gets at the argument that, in lieu of novel mechanisms, why can't we just use the general fund? So we've heard that in many circles. We've heard it throughout 2013 with our finance caucus. This will give us some real insight into, why not? What about that? What does that look like quantitatively? So I think this will be really helpful in informing that discussion. We take the chunk of novel mechanism that was necessary to fill the gap of the preceding scenario, and allocate general fund to it and see what that does to the general fund, percent increases and so on, one of the metrics. One is accelerated. What if we the rich uncle scenario, what if we are able to accelerate funding on the front end and start implementing more stuff than the 2 to 4 billion?
I want one.
Yeah, we all want one. So this one, needless to say, I'll bias us right now and say, I don't think this one passes the plausibility one, but I'll leave that to you.
LA just did this with transportation funding on the federal government on the past administration, where we passed a sales tax that was going to come in over 30 years, and we got federal money up front to do all our work in the first 10 years, and then paying it off in the back end with the state, with the tax revenue.
So that can be like a plausibility narrative right
There
there.
you go. There you go.
Case in point.
Somewhere in here, I'd like to bring up the same thing that we brought up during the SEAC about reimbursement-based grants. And I know that it's not, the DAC program is not meant to be that way, but it's up to the regional water management group to choose to be reimbursement or not. And then the community organizations, community groups, tribal groups, whatever that come under that umbrella have to fall under that. And sometimes the decision doesn't benefit the smaller groups underneath. And that I would suggest that Cali, PA has a small community grants program where they allow the recipient to receive a certain percentage of it to get started, so that people don't have to take out loans to get started. And I know that there's a fear that someone will lose money because if you give money to someone, is what is the requirement? You know, there could be. I know that North Coast Research Partnership, Humboldt County, what they're doing is they're saying, hey, get you guys started. We're going to, you know, go ahead and put this funding in, and then if DWR rejects any portion of it, we're going to take it out of your next invoice. You know, so there's ways of allowing for some sort of mechanism in there, but it's very difficult to come up with the money up front when you're a disadvantaged community to start with.
Is there a place in the recommendations that would make sense for that too?
Well, we have the funding priority category of recommendations. That's where it would go.
So let's flag that one too, maybe, and that's in chapter 3.
Okay.
And see if that, there's probably, it doesn't say what you just said, but there's probably some room in there to do that, right?
There's some scenarios, because I know that people are coming up with them, but then some may not be able to think outside the box that they were previously given. And it would be nice to have them see something.
Okay.
I would recommend too, if we do that, think about, I'd invite you to think about the accompanying finding, which would be in chapter 4. Again, chapter 4 makes a case for the recommendation.
Oh, this is a really powerful place to make some comments right in this section. So some of these areas that why you have to take, these drive the recommendations and drive the funding approaches. So this will be really, it will be really important to nail this.
So this is where we talk about challenges and.
And just some of the, I think what Sherry was just talking about too, is just some structural problems with the way we administer things that are inherently problematic for certain communities.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Did you have?
Oh, just curious. I mean, that's a hot topic. Yesterday, the State Board and the PUC had a joint hearing on water affordability and the financing. I don't know if anybody here attended or watched online, but it'll just be an interesting feature to see how you massage in a moving target.
Since they're working
into this.
now.
I mean, it's all live now.
So is Max working on that?
Yeah, Max is your guy for that.
All right, maybe we can just drag him over and maybe I wonder if we can have him come Monday.
Isn't it often that stable and sufficient funding sources don't exist?
Yeah, not absolute, you mean, or?
Right.
Yes, we can clarify that.
I mean, unless this is all disadvantaged community context, then the sentence should get worked around to make that clear, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, the whole idea of consolidation over at State Board is that's the idea of like there does exist capacity to do this. We just have to assemble it properly, right?
Yeah, this would be another area where I'd really flag you guys to pay attention in this section.
And this is kind of, again, keying off of that first paragraph that we talked about, which is there's certain areas in particular that are struggling, not geographical per se, sectors, if we want to call it that. And so the same thing goes, and maybe for how we characterize DACs in this finding, that floods, you know, and ecosystem.
Yeah, I hate to keep bringing up the tribal piece, but what we've noticed is if it's not in there explicitly, then it can be interpreted that they would be excluded, and that happens a lot. And so that's why.
So on that one, Kristen, could you just take an action item to just mention to Bill just that, as well as things that Anastasia said about characterization, tribal government, tribe as capital. Just, and that'll just remind us to check in with him.
In fairness to Bill, he hasn't really had a chance to.
Yeah, no, he hasn't seen it all. It's just, if he's aware of it, so he will address it. Yeah, he's really good about that.
Oh, yeah.
Honestly, they could circulate the memo to everybody. That would be helpful.
Oh, and we actually had a really good discussion with some earlier drafters.
Uh-huh.
We did the water plan update, and the water action plan update.
Okay.
With that.
Yeah.
And you're right, I think it's the first time I worked with Bill that closely.
Yeah, and he will be happy to do. It's just a matter of knowing. It's like some of what we do is just ignorant, right? So.
And we can broach the whole scale issue watershed here. I mean, part of this too. This isn't phrased well, but the last one is meant to say it can be more effective for state government to incentivize outcomes. And leave it up to the regions to determine how that occurs, and those outcomes can be specified at a scale. And we want to improve fisheries health within this watershed. That's a public benefit that state government would like to incent, which is a departure a little bit from, let's fund these types of projects or categories of things that can be implemented. It's operating at, I think, a higher level, and it provides more flexibility. So anyway, this is a place where we want to tell that story as well.
It also requires you to be much more diligent in your oversight of the actual achievement of those outcomes.
It's not did you pour the concrete or spend the money.
Right.
Yeah.
And the distribution.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
that's kind of what I
the
meant,
distributional
right?
fairness of
Yes.
the outcome.
Yeah.
Right.
So then this goes into the next section about the findings.
These are the types of metrics we're looking at just to guide our decisions. So things like for a novel mechanism, what is the cost per capita as one potential metric? And so we can talk about what's most informative. We can do stuff that's specific to specific novel mechanisms, like a watershed assessment. These last two are, based on real property, so some metric, cost per parcel, equivalent cost per parcel.
Speaking of novel mechanism, is there a way to address for the legislators if we're looking at additional funding from states is, like creating those funding areas, and, now that we have these funding areas, they were literally given to DWR. We had to do something with that.
I can do her nose.
And because, we're still seeing whether that is actually appropriate funding areas or not. And based on whose metrics was that created from. And if they did take that from DWR's documents, I don't think they would have come up with 12 funding areas based on that. So is there a way then to, because I'm looking at this always as looking future, and those funding areas, if you were even to look at it from a DAC metric or tribal metric, it's been totally imbalanced for that. So I don't know if that's just a place for that, or back to chapter 3, because have we adopted the funding mechanism as just a as a permanent structure going forward in the next 15, 20, 30 years, and having to use that within Sigma, which is a 40, 50 years out, based on those funding areas, and who's getting the monies on that.
Yeah, it sounds like, chapter 3 and even maybe 5, when we recommend a funding mix, the breakdown of how this can be implemented and new, considerations for administration.
The interesting enough, the funding areas as constructed actually in part came from 2005 water plan.
Right.
That was
the
at the
hydrologic
time
regions
by the hydrologic regions with the 2 overlay spaces, and then they actually looked in 2013 at adjusting that a little bit, and there was so much pushback because it would have upcarded all the existing. I got just a couple sentences for you. The existing funding approaches, and that once people had money coming in a certain way, they didn't want that change. So this would be Lewis in the middle of all those conversations. But this would be a time to consider that.
And as you get more community engagement, the outlook's going to look totally different, and we're seeing that already.
Right.
So I just don't want to be able to lose that conversation that started to address it or to criticize it or to make it better.
It also, Sherry actually raised this a second ago, or a few minutes ago, about the fact that the uplands aren't really represented in ways that are as helpful because of the way those overlays are structured.
Yeah.
So this is certainly a limitation that has been pointed out, but now's the time, this is a good time to address it in this section.
And relative to the benefit they provide,
Right.
the rest of the downstream
Right.
users dramatically underfunded.
And I'm just looking over at Lou, he's been in
There's a
so many
comical typo.
conversations about this.
The typo on there, yeah.
He's got what, is that what you were gonna say? I didn't see it.
What's
Where is
the typo?
it?
For
Any comedy?
$100 of half-assed value of
Thank you.
Yep.
Some humor.
I don't see it.
Okay, but,
If I had to look it up.
That's why it wasn't spell checked properly.
Wherever the cursor's at.
that's just how we roll. Okay. All right. So that's us. Okay. There's so many things that can go wrong.
I love it.
That's why,
I love
that's
it.
why there's a disclaimer.
That's right. Okay. So anyway, this focus, so again, you can see this trade-off, the way some of these are laid out, the findings. This is very powerful stuff. This is the chapter that's probably going to get lifted to go write legislation with. It'll be, this will be a big piece of it. So every finding that we can write that's really strong, it will be recorded in budget change proposals, all kinds of stuff. That's where that stuff will show up.
I can just kind of close out this chapter with the table. This kind of sums it up, where we're headed with the determinations. So we have the scenarios. We have, how much would general fund have to increase if we go heavy on general fund with paying for Chapter 3, geo bonds. From a novel mechanism standpoint, what are the trade-offs? Cost per capita per parcel. We talked about that.
Hey, Lynn, are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, great. What do you think about this funding area thing? Did you have anything? I know this really affects you.
Well, I'm tracking what you're saying, but when I'm looking at where you are.
Oh, it's a little bit further up. I just realized that you were on the line, and we should check. It's a little bit above. We were talking about the funding areas. So one of the things that we're talking about is should we take another look at the current funding areas as they're laid out? Is that something that should be addressed, do you think, here? Because I know that will really affect.
In the finding?
Well, no, I mean this larger funding area. This is a big deal for the IRWM. So I just want to make sure that I had flagged her on that as well. Okay.
Well, and it seems like that needs to be. I mean, there's a lot of linking that needs to happen between what goes on in the previous parts, depending on how the areas get defined.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to change from IRWM regions as they currently stand now to something else. I mean, the hydrologic areas were an overlay that the state has for funding under Prop 84 and now Prop 1. Whether those the 12 hydrologic or funding areas should be maintained on the larger scale, or whether you're talking about funding areas, meaning the IRWM regions, I think that needs to be discussed. If we keep the scale of IRWM regions as they've been self-determined by the regions to this point, then I think then maybe that's what we want to do. But I guess it depends. It has to be tied. I would think this area needs to be tied back to what happens in the earlier sections of the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Is that making any sense?
Yeah, it does. I just want to make sure you're tracking on that, because there's some inherent problems with the current structure of it, and also there's a lot of skin in the game already. So when we start walking down that road, that needs to be a bigger conversation. Go ahead, Sherry.
I was going to say that I think this is a conversation that could be had pretty easily with the mountain counties and the Sac River Regional Water Management groups that are dealing with within their region, having to compete, and with each other and the downstream users. I have a feeling that they would be able to give us some good information on what they could imagine this looking like, because they are also protective over their current regional boundaries at the same time, but they do recognize that. So that's a good conversation probably to have with our WMGs and.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just definitely want to make sure Lynn was tracking that, because and that will affect the roundtable.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry
Thank
to.
you.
Okay.
So again, just to round out this chapter, and yeah, I have a meeting with the agency at 1. So we talked about kind of the trade-offs with the levels of, equivalent levels of funding with different mechanisms. Dollars per, okay, we got it right here at least. So, and then percent funded, you know, with the bond heavy scenario, capital will do pretty well, ongoing probably less so, inverse with general fund, that type of thing, identifying those types of trade-offs. And then overall, how do the recommendations fare? You know, we saw that it was really capital heavy in that estimate, so obviously the pay-as-you-go probably wouldn't do too well capital needs for Chapter 3. That's the type of trade-offs we're articulating. And then overall, there's a cost to borrowing, kind of refer to it as general fund plus interest is basically what it is. So how do we pick that up by looking at out 50 years? What's the total cost? Pay-as-you-go then would probably look pretty well, albeit not as plausible. I'll say that, but it'll help us tease out those effects.
And could just scroll back to the beginning of the chart.
And then that last column is it recommended to go forward? Is the scenario recommended to go forward in Chapter 5?
So this trade-off analysis is the financial trade-off analysis. So something to consider is, do you need to have a sort of societal trade-off analysis as well? And so I'm just going to throw that out there. And what would that look like? What would the criteria for that be?
You mean in terms of paying for water versus paying for good education?
Right, and just the trade-offs of any of these particular scenarios about the way things are funded. Would, you know, how could that potentially affect people from a societal perspective versus just a pure trade-off of the finance? This is a financial trade-off.
But this is all state spending?
Yes.
And before you answer that too, I'll just point out I had a column in there. I don't know where it went, and it was who pays. So I mean, at the highest level, it's ratepayer, taxpayer, property owner, but that can be kind of refined also across the population if we want. So
You're the one that told me about the number of subsidized rates. It was striking. It was like,
oh, some discussions about water surcharges in the past, to quantify the revenue, had to recognize the percent of Lifeline folks that would not be paying into it. So that's part of the cost per capita where 35% pays. That's arbitrary. It's not scientific. But given that every infant and retiree wouldn't be on the hook, to make it more realistic, a subset of the population would be actually the one paying for these, particularly the novel.
Yeah, you have a footnote up there describing where the 35% came from. I saw it earlier. Because I'm learning that not everybody knows this, but all of our phone bills helps pay for every phone jack in the state, whether it has service or not, has 911 service, right? So this would be a useful narrative when talking to the water utilities who are resistant to helping collect dollars for Lifeline work.
Yeah.
right. So that gets, so as we're, again, this is a trade-off relative to the financial trade-off, but there's some other kinds of trade-offs that are not articulated yet. That's the place where the community can weigh in a little bit and say, here's some things you should be looking at in terms of trade-off. So, okay, and then where are we at in the doc?
That's the end.
That's the end. Okay, well, I'm very mindful that there's a number of people have other meetings immediately following. So next steps, we had, at the end, we had 2 potential documents for follow-up, possibly doing a white paper. I'm going to look at the 2 of you. Do you have ideas about next steps relative to white papers?
Well, trying to figure out, Lisa, what role the white paper would play.
Can I ask the exact same question?
Right. The white paper would be used to explain or augment anything that's in the shorter 100-page document where you wanted to explore some nuances, where you may want to provide some policy perspective, something like legislative intent so that when we talk about these things, these are the things that should be on the table as we're considering it. So it will be pulling out at, extracting. There were potentially some things in the vision document that roll up nicely. So part of it would be to go back and see. In fact, when they constructed the recommendations, they actually looked at the vision document. That is something that they pulled, as well as some of the IRWM piece that Mike Floyd worked on. What's the name of that?
Stakeholder perspectives.
Stakeholder perspectives. Right. So they actually started with those documents, as well as some of the recommendations from Sigma and other places, and tried to extract and roll up, as well as the old Water Plan 2013 recommendations. So, maybe as you're reading this, we don't try to answer that question today.
Well, I can throw something forward. I mean, I stand on the agency side trying to build the bridge, right? And I know Colin stands on the community side trying to build the bridge. So I guess from my perspective, a white paper that I think would be really valuable and I'd love to contribute to would build out of the earlier disadvantaged community pilots and the visioning workshop, and then the reality of what's happening in Prop 1 at State Board and through Disadvantaged Community Development Program, to talk about the state's role in providing resources for facilitation, coordination, and technical assistance that specifically for communities that don't have that capacity on their own or can't together fund that capacity, because that rationale sat inside the Watershed Coordinators Program and was kiboshed by some folks in the legislative analysts positions on Prop 1. And it might be really good to enunciate, especially in the context of some of the other things that are in here, why that's a proper expenditure by the state to support equity and funding these specialists to do the work. So I think that'd be one that I'd love to contribute to, and I'm wondering if that, and I'm not sure if it belongs, the other things that you're thinking of would belong in there with it, or whether something you're thinking about would be a separate one.
Among the things that came to my mind as we spoke were, you heard me talk about the history piece, which if we, I wouldn't want to orphan it necessarily, so I would want to see and hear some feedback from you all who are drafting that in the drivers we can actually call it out, and maybe you don't have 5 pages of it in the short form, but you do hit it clearly, and then you append the statement that says, here's what we're talking about, so that there's context.
And the document itself will also be an online document, so you will be able to hot link out of it. And that would be, so the key thing for in terms of what Mike said, just in terms of structurally, we just need to make sure there's a recommendation that's tight enough that it's very clear that here's the link you're going to hit where it's going to explain what this means, where we can talk a little bit more about the philosophy of it. And the same thing with yours, is that text is there that we can put the footnote on it, or we can hot link it out.
Yeah, and kind of, these are almost sequential in a way, although I think we probably treat them separately. We talked earlier about how DWR doesn't have the same kind of institutional pronouncement that we address environmental injustice, right? Like, this is a core value of the work that we do. It's across all of our various programs. I think it'd be worthwhile to craft something that use the state water plan process to at least get internal DWR buy-in to that. And because it's a steeply hierarchical institution, get buy-in at the very top level, which I think some of the conversation we had last month suggested is very likely there. And let that be what, to my knowledge, would be the first strong pronouncement of the sort ever made by DWR.
And I'm not sure if it fits here or somewhere else, but some of it that we found in the North Coast is it'd be nice to hear from communities and tribes about how they felt about the specialists that were provided to them, and whether or not they'd like to have their own specialists be trained and empowered, or whether it's okay to continue with the model of having a specific facilitation group that's the only one that can do X, Y, or Z. I mean, it keeps coming to mind. It's not just because we're a small nonprofit, we might be asked, but there are things that are wheelhouses that we totally, completely don't even work on, that we've heard kind of some negative feedback on, and we're like,
Right.
Where does that come out?
Yeah, these are good opportunities. And then also, so like the tribal piece, the tribal summit proceedings will be part of the document. And also, there may be some pieces in here that the tribal community might want to do a white paper on also. So just to think about. And some of it will be a natural association, but some of it won't. So, that's just something to keep in mind. Or as you're thinking about summit planning, is there anything in here that could roll into the summit planning where you could have that be part of your proceedings conversation? And again, I haven't been working on that, so I don't know, but this would be a really wonderful opportunity to think about what that conversation might look like.
And I would also invite you to consider on the implementation side, again, I kind of keep referring to it as the rubber meets the road. When we articulate new novel mechanisms that may be in play, should the legislature pick it up and run with it, teeing off of the recommendations, from the tribal and DAC perspectives on how things need to be administered or so.
Mike had asked a question if that was what I was thinking when he made his proposal. I think, Paul, your suggestion there actually goes right back to Mike's proposal, which I wholeheartedly endorse.
Yeah.
Which is, we're in a new regime now with Prop 1 that has elements to it from which we should be learning as much as we possibly can to inform what you just described, which is how does that reflect on all these different scenarios for implementation, administration, et cetera.
And another part to that is like in Chapter 3 recommendation, Sherry, I'd like to work with, I think we're going to follow the Tribal Water Summit planning meeting with, as well as our tribal stakeholder group to look at this, because I do see when we had to implement as an agency along with State Water Board, the Prop 1 initial funding for the funding DACs, I mean, things were going so fast, and I think that lessons learned on how to do that, and one of the things I did see as a disadvantage to communities was when we had to just make a judgment call from the agency perspective was straight to counties versus having that be more open, and the ability to say the state agency be more open, you can do one-on-one grants versus having to have it funneled through another. So that was just creating additional hurdles. And why can't communities and tribal governments be just this is our need, we can get a portion of this on top of that. So you carve out 10% for disadvantaged communities, and so you have that $510 million, and you can carve out an additional whatever that number will be. And so I do see that would have been a real big benefit, even just in the initial planning, opportunities from a lessons learned perspective. Because I know that one of the things you're talking about bridging is, the pilot study, what was, successes going forward. And so, I think if where is that going to be? That's good for the Chapter 3 documentation.
It's also a little bit like 5 too.
And
how the implementation piece of it. So
because if we get additional funding, I'd like to be able to have agency individuals who are doing the funding being able to say, we can, lessons learned, we can be more open. It does not have to go just to these specific groups.
Yeah, I mean, Chapter 3 is kind of what we're recommending be done. Chapter 5 is how to do it. So that is a rule of thumb to kind of distinguish.
So I'm going to actually people have to go to another meeting, so I'm going to do a couple things. First of all, I want to express appreciation. This is a different meeting than we normally have. Colin, with some help from Mike, organized this, which was a huge gift. So just first of all, can we thank the organizers for the... the second thing is we Paul and I, in particular, we're really looking forward to today because we don't normally get to just sit down and talk to people. So I just want to express appreciation for everyone's willingness to be in this kind of a conversation. It's a lot different than some of our big meetings. I think Paul needs like a bazillion claps because how much work he has done. I mean, the transition. He's been working on this for days to be ready for this. So I know how, because I talked to you. So we have a good team. Of course, we've got the amazing Francisco who's been doing our online meeting. Kristen's doing our notes. All the people in the room, everybody online. Thank you. Look at, they're still there. Thank you, everyone. All right. Did you have a last thought out the door?
No.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I know you have to be at agency at 1. I think I have a 1 o'clock. You guys have a date.
Lisa, you took notes, right?
I took a lot of notes, and I also took a lot of specific notes on different things people said they were going to give to others, or by specific parts. So we can summarize that and summary and highlight the action items.
That'd be great if there's anything that we grabbed that we missed.
Right.
Well, I
Give back.
normally, I wouldn't have had a note taker, but I felt like I really needed one today.
And
Yes.
that actually
I took
recorded.
notes too.
Yes, this is
Okay.
also recorded.
So we could.
So we'll have the recording of this, and that'll be online Friday by the end of the year. And then the notes are sometimes being hard to get track. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
That was hot. You.
Yeah.
Right, those scenarios, each
I actually think
they
it's fun to do.
insertion